Hey everybody, this is chapter 4 of Z.A. Jordan's The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism, a philosophical and sociological analysis. This chapter is chapter 4 of the book, and it's titled French Positivism and the Philosophy of Marx. Section 1 of this chapter is titled The Evaluation of Saint-Simon and Comte by Marx, Engels and their followers. 2. The positivistic background of Marxian philosophy. And 3. The elements of positivist philosophy in Engels.
Saint-Simon. Saint-Simon.
Okay, Saint-Simon. Okay, I just want to make sure I was saying the name right, because I always feel like I'm saying it wrong. Alright, let's see if I can get to this chapter. Okay, so it starts on page 111. Okay, let me get to the end notes. Let's see, where am I? Sorry about this. Just trying to find where the hell I'm supposed to be in terms of... This is why endnotes are so fucking stupid. I hate that. I hate endnotes. I hate this shit. And you should too. Come on. Alright, so here we are. I have two windows of this PDF open. One for the actual text and one for the endnotes. And now I'm there. Okay, French Positivism and the Philosophy of Marx and Engels. Chapter 4 of The Evolution of Dialectical Materialism, a Philosophical and Sociological Analysis. The relation of Marx and Engels to French positivism is distorted by their political enmity to Comte. It is also obscured by the dispute between the Saint-Simonists and the Comtists concerning the origin of positivism. The political hostility of Marx and Engels to Comte clearly colored their views about positivism and influenced their evaluation of the relative importance of Saint-Simon and Comte in the history of philosophical, social, and political ideas. The poor opinion that they held of Comte, both as a social reformer and philosopher, greatly affected their followers, who frequently took it for granted that Marx and Engels could not have been influenced by a thinker whom they held in so little esteem. While, quote, positivism is a term closely associated with Comte's name and his conception of knowledge, Comte neither coined the term nor defined the concept. Madame de Staël introduced the expression, quote, the positive sciences, end quote, and, quote, the philosophy of the positive science, end quote, in 1800, and Saint-Simon may have adopted them from her. Let's see if we can find anything for Miss Madame de Staël. First, let's see. Yeah. Let's see. Wikipedia says Germaine de Staël. I don't know how to pronounce this person's name. Let's see.
Madame de Staël. Madame de Staël. Madame de Staël.
Madame de Staël. Anna Louise Germaine de Staël-Holstein lived from 1766 to 1817 and is commonly known as Madame de Staël, was a prominent philosopher, woman of letters, and political theorist in both Parisian and Genevan intellectual circles. Madame de Staël was the daughter of banker and French finance minister Jacques Necker and Suzanne Curchod, a respected saloon hostess. Throughout her life, she held a moderate stance during the tumultuous periods of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic era, persisting until the time of the French Restoration. Madame de Staël's presence at critical events such as the Estates General of 1789 and the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen underscored her engagement in the political discourse of her time. However, Madame de Staël faced exile for extended periods, initially during the Reign of Terror and subsequently due to personal persecution by Napoleon. Madame de Staël claimed to have discerned the tyrannical nature and ambitions of his rule ahead of many others. During her exile, Madame de Staël fostered the Coppée Group, a network that spanned across Europe, positioning herself at its heart. Her literary works, emphasizing individuality and passion, left an enduring imprint on European intellectual thought. De Staël's repeated championing of Romanticism contributed significantly to its widespread recognition. Madame de Staël's literary legacy has somewhat faded with time. Her critical and historical contributions hold undeniable significance. Though her novels and plays may now be less remembered, the value of her analytical and historical writings remains steadfast. Within her work, de Staël not only advocates for the necessity of public expression, but also sounds cautionary notes about its potential hazards. So that's Madame de Staël. Back to the text. Madame de Staël introduced the expression, quote, the positive sciences, end quote, and, quote, the philosophy of positive science, end quote, in 1800, and Saint-Simon may have adopted them from her. Saint-Simon used the terms, quote, positive philosophy and, quote, positive science frequently, and gave them the meaning derived from the views of the ideologues. Footnote. The philosophical group in France, which is misleadingly called the, quote, ideologues, and which flourished during the Revolution and the First Empire, includes such thinkers as Corbigny, who lived from 1757 to 1808, Destutt de Tracy, who lived from 1754 to 1836, and Volney, who lived from 1757 to 1820. The ideologues continued and systematized the ideas of Locke, Condillac, and Helvetius. End footnote. The ideologues were anxious to be empirical in their investigations, including their examinations of moral and political problems. They believed that to achieve this goal, they should emancipate their investigation from religious and metaphysical presuppositions and base them on anthropological or sociological foundations. Where am I? The ideologue. This is the meaning which Saint-Simon gave to the expression, quote, positive science, end quote, and which the expression positive science retained, with some revisions and amplifications in Comte. Footnote. See F.A. Hayek, The Counter-Revolution of Science, and F.E. Manuel, The New World of Henri Saint-Simon. Comte was not the only founder of positivism, as a conception of knowledge or philosophical doctrine. Comte shared this distinction with Saint-Simon. Although Comte failed to recognize Saint-Simon as his forerunner, and later in his career spoke abusively of Saint-Simon, Comte's claim to complete originality cannot be accepted. After Emile Durkheim's study of this controversial issue, no doubt remains that whereas Comte developed the positive philosophy and gave the positivist philosophy, positivist philosophy's systematic form, Saint-Simon provided the positivist philosophy's first outline, even if he expressed the positivist philosophy ineptly and confusedly. Footnote: Emile Durkheim, Socialism and Saint-Simon, and F.E. Manuel, The New World of Henri Saint-Simon, which supports Durkheim's verdict with some reservations. End footnote. The dual authorship of the positive philosophy throws much light on the relation of Marx and Engels to this doctrine. Marx and Engels may have been exposed to the influence of positivism not only through Comte, of whom they spoke disparagingly, but also through Saint-Simon, whom they extolled. Moreover, their severe and contemptuous criticism of Comte has been understood to imply that they rejected positivism altogether. This inference is based on the premise that one cannot have positivism without Comte, and that one cannot be influenced by a thinker whom one dismisses as a political philosopher and reformer. This conclusion is incorrect. Simply because Marx and Engels did not wish to have anything to do with Comte does not mean that they remained in point of fact entirely unaffected by their encounter with positivism. Section 1. The Evaluation of Saint-Simon and Comte by Marx, Engels, and their followers. Marx and Engels expressed their views about Saint-Simon, who lived from 1760 to 1825, and Comte, who lived from 1798 to 1857, frequently, and there is not the slightest doubt that they admired Saint-Simon and abhorred Comte. To judge from his observation on, quote, savage communism, end quote, which degraded equality and crushed liberty, Comte seemed to have reciprocated the hostility. Marx and Engels despised Comte mainly because of Comte's social and political views, formulated in the period to which Comte referred as his second career, and during which Comte accomplished the transfiguration from the philosopher and author of Cours de philosophie positive into the high priest of the religion of humanity, expounded in Système de politique positive and other works. Sorry, 1 second. I feel like maybe 75% of my videos is just me going, oh, my internet's not working. Okay. Marx regarded Comte. Excuse me. There's a footnote here that I missed. The reader should keep in mind the fact that the 6 volumes of the Cours first appeared in the years 1830 to 42, and the 4 volumes of the Système in the years 1851 to 54. End footnote. Marx regarded Comte as a philosopher of reaction for a number of reasons. Comte defended the institution of private property and supported the rule of the rich over the poor and the rights of the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. Comte welcomed Louis Bonaparte's deliverance of the Republic from parliamentary government and subordinated the political and economic emancipation of the people to their moral regeneration. Comte urged the acceptance of religion, though religion without a God, as a motive to socially desirable conduct. Vivre pour autrui, and as a source of collective emotions that preserve social unity and stability from revolutionary upheavals. Footnote: Marx was not alone in his detestation of some of Comte's social and political beliefs. John Stuart Mill, an ardent admirer of Comte, the positivist philosopher, described his program of social and political reform as a system of spiritual and temporal despotism, surpassing every precedent in history, ancient and modern. Mill's conclusion was that, quote, while as logicians we were nearly at one, as sociologists we could travel together no further, end quote. Mill's On Liberty and his autobiography. Speaking of Comte's religion of humanity and its code of religious practices, Mill said, quote, others may laugh, but we could rather weep at this melancholy decadence of a great intellect, end quote. Auguste Comte and Positivism. The break between Émile Littré and Comte was caused by the approval of the latter accorded to Louis Bonaparte's coup d'état. See W. M. Simon's European Positivism in the 19th Century, of which Mill also strongly disapproved. Mill deeply agreed with Comte's attacks upon what he designated with the generic name of the, quote, revolutionary philosophy, end quote. That is, Comte's rejection of the radical, the democratic, the liberal, the free-thinking views as alleged instances of the metaphysical mode of thought in politics. End footnote. Marx rejected all these views and ideas because he regarded them not only as sociologically erroneous, but also as politically harmful. It is true that in the 1860s, Marx came into contact with the French and English Comtists, who took part in the organization and activities of the International Working Men's Association, and that his association with the, quote, positivist, end quote, Edward Spencer Beazley was particularly close. Who is Edward Spencer Beazley? Okay, so Edward Spencer Beazley, according to Wikipedia, was an English positivist, trade union activist, and historian who lived from 1831 to 1915. Okay, it looks like I've been able to get the internet to work enough to look at these books by Comte. The Cours de philosophie positive is translated into English as Course of Positive Philosophy, and Wikipedia says, the Course of Positive Philosophy was a series of texts written by the French philosopher of science and founding sociologist Auguste Comte between 1830 and 1842. Within the work he unveiled the epistemological perspective of positivism. The works were translated into English by Harriet Martineau and condensed to form the Positive Philosophy of Auguste Comte, published in 1853. It has been described as a foundational text for the discipline of sociology. And there's not really anything actually for Système de Politique Positive. Okay. Back to the text. Since Marx and the Comtists discovered a certain measure of agreement in their views on the urgent political tasks facing the working class at that time, Marx's hostility towards Comte's followers relented somewhat. This did not change, however, in the slightest his opinion of Comte and positivism. See, for example, Marx's letter to Engels on the 19th of March, 1870, Marx's letter to L. Kugelmann of the 13th of December, 1870. E.S. Beazley, who lived from 1831 to 1914, was professor of history at University College London, presided the meeting in St. Martin Hall in 1864 at which the First International was founded. E.S. Beazley was a social reformer inspired in his activities by Kant, but not at all interested in the Comtean philosophy. What brought Beazley and Marx together was not philosophical interests, but common views on a number of public, social, and international affairs. Their association was particularly close in the period of the Franco-German War and the Paris Commune. In his letters to Ferdinand Tönnies of the 24th of January, 1895, Engels paid warm tribute to Beazley for his defense of the International and the press at the time of the Commune. For details concerning the relationship between Marx and Beazley, see Royd and Harrison, E.S. Beazley, and Karl Marx. The participation of the French, quote, positivists in the activities of the First International is mentioned in the Marx-Engels correspondence. The resolution passed at the conference of the International held in London in September 1871, which prohibited the use of any sectarian names by the local sections in the National Federal Councils of the International, listed also, quote, positivist, end quote, among these prohibited sectarian names. In the above-quoted letter to Ferdinand Tönnies, Engels noted that in the middle 70s, the Comtists cooled off considerably towards the labor movement. End footnote. Marx and Engels did not follow in the footsteps of Émile Littré in France and of John Stuart Mill in England, who differentiated between the first and second part of Comte's work, between his clear, original, and important exposition of positive philosophy on the one hand and his subjective speculations on politics, morality, and religion on the other.
Émile Littré.
All right, I'm saying it right. Émile Littré. Wikipedia says Émile Littré is a very grumpy-looking man. Lived from 1801 to 1881 and was a French lexicographer, Freemason, and philosopher, best known for his Dictionnaire de la langue française, commonly called by Le Littré. I feel like I need a refresher on John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill lived from 1806 to 1873 and was an English philosopher, political economist, politician, and civil servant. One of the most influential thinkers in the history of liberalism, John Stuart Mill contributed widely to social theory, and political economy, dubbed, quote, the most influential English-speaking philosopher of the 19th century, end quote. By the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, he conceived of liberty as justifying the freedom of the individual in opposition to unlimited state and social control. John Stuart Mill was a proponent of utilitarianism and ethical theory developed by his predecessor Jeremy Bentham. He contributed to the investigation of scientific methodology through his knowledge of the topic, though his knowledge of the topic was based on the writings of others. Notably, William Whewell, John Herschel, and Auguste Comte, and research carried out for Mill by Alexander Bain. He engaged in written debate with Whewell, a member of the Liberal Party and author of the early feminist work, The Subjection of Women. Mill was also the second member of Parliament to call for women's suffrage after Henry Hunt in 1832. All right, so back to the text. Marx and Engels did not follow in the footsteps of Émile Littré in France and John Stuart Mill in England, who differentiated between the first and second part of Comte's work, between his clear, original, and important exposition of positive philosophy on the one hand and his subsequent speculations on politics, morality, and religion on the other. Marx as well as Engels refused to see in Comte's positivism any merit at all, and held as poor an opinion of his philosophy as his politics. Quote, as a party man, end quote, Marx wrote to E.S. Beasley, quote, I entertain a thoroughly hostile attitude toward Comtism, while as a scientific man I have a very poor opinion of it, end quote. Footnote. Marx's letter to E.S. Beasley on the 12th of June, 1871, end footnote. Marx regarded Cours de philosophie positive as, quote, trashy, quote, wretched, end quote, in every respect inferior to the philosophy of Hegel and unworthy of the fuss that the British and French reading public made over it at that time. Quote, it seems to me, end quote, Marx said to Engels, quote, that positive philosophy means as much as the ignorance of everything possible, end quote. Marx. A Comtist is a man who indulges in writing, quote, recipes for the cookshops of the future, end quote. That is, a belated utopian who is obliged to support, quote, all sorts of crotchets, end quote. Marx's letter to Engels on the 20th of March, 1869, and Marx's letter to L. Kugelmann on the 13th of December, 1870. Also see Capital Volume 1, page 17. End footnote. I don't know if I said footnote, but that was a footnote. Engels discovered in Comte's system a, quote, series of brilliant thoughts, end quote, which were, however, practically always useless, quote, because of insufficient development, end quote, a, quote, narrow Philistine mode of outlook, end quote, and a thoroughly pedestrian, quote, hierarchically organized religious constitution, end quote, quote, Catholicism without Christianity, end quote. Engels was sure that Comte's partiality to religion provided a clue to the discrepancy between the brilliance of Comte's mind and the Philistinism of his outlook. Moreover, quote, Comte took all his bright ideas from Saint-Simon, but mutilated them, end quote, and, quote, dragged them down to a lower level, reshaping them in Philistine fashion to the best of his ability, end quote. Engels. Footnote. Engels' letter to Ferdinand Tönnies, 24th of January, 1895. Engels' low opinion of Comte could not have been improved by the admiration of Comte shown by Eugen Düring. See W. M. Simon, European Positivism in the 19th Century. End footnote. The Comtists were even worse than Comte himself. The Comtists were in danger of outdoing the Hegelians who, in the words of a Bonn professor, understood nothing about anything but wrote about everything. Footnote. Engels' letter to Marx, the 21st of March, 1869, end footnote. On the other hand, Saint-Simon was one of the, quote, three great utopians, end quote. The other two being Fourier and Owen, who, quote, in spite of all their fantastic notions and all their utopianism, have their place among the most eminent thinkers of all times, end quote. Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen, quote, anticipated innumerable things, end quote, Engels wrote, quote, the correctness of which is now being scientifically proved by us, end quote. Engels. Footnote. Engels' admiration for the, quote, dazzling genius of Saint-Simon and some of his pupils dates from the moment his interest in social and political questions were first seriously awakened. See Engels, Progress of Social Reform on the Continent, end quote, in the collected works. End footnote. Whatever their shortcomings and defects were, Saint-Simon, Owen, and Fourier attacked in the words of the Communist Manifesto, quote, every principle of existing society, end quote, and, quote, hence, Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen are full of the most valuable materials for the enlightenment of the working class, end quote. It is true that in Capital, Marx showed considerable reserve with respect to Saint-Simon, for the latter did not recognize the class antagonism between industrial capitalists and workers, but lumped them together in a single class under the name of travailleurs. Let's see, I've been pronouncing this word a certain way for a while. Let's see how it's actually pronounced, since I have the French to English translator just opened up.
Travailleur.
Travailleur. Alright, I'm kind of close. Travailleur, which obviously translates to worker, and failed to rise to the awareness of the historical role to be played by the proletariat. Consequently, practically all the writings of Saint-Simon were, quote, mere glorifications of modern bourgeois society against feudal society, end quote. The single exception was Saint-Simon's last work, La Nouveau Christianisme, where he spoke, quote, directly for the working class, end quote, and declared, quote, their emancipation to be the end of his efforts, end quote. Marx, capital. Footnote. This evaluation would put Saint-Simon in the same category as Comte ideologically. Marx's evaluation of Saint-Simon is irreproachable if the concept of socialism includes the recognition of a class struggle between the property and propertyless classes. End footnote. But Engels explained in an editorial footnote that this criticism of Saint-Simon did not represent Marx's balanced judgment, for as a rule, Marx, quote, spoke only with admiration of the genius and encyclopedic brain of Saint-Simon, end quote. Engels' testimony is corroborated by a comparison of Saint-Simon's and Marx's views, which reveal that Marx is in deep debt to Saint-Simon's philosophy of history. In Engels' opinion, Saint-Simon was not simply one of the three utopians, but the greatest of them all, endowed as Saint-Simon was with a, quote, comprehensive breadth of view, by virtue of which almost all the ideas of later socialists that are not strictly economic are found in him in embryo. End quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Saint-Simon's encyclopedic knowledge was second to none, including Hegel, and this praise coming from Engels, a great admirer of Hegel's erudition, could not be exceeded. Saint-Simon was, quote, a genius and mystic in one, end quote. A writer and thinker who, quote, positively suffered from repleteness of thought, end quote, and whose reputation unjustly declined after his death because Saint-Simon's followers, quote, developed certain aspects of Saint-Simon's teaching to the detriment of the magnificent conception as a whole, end quote. Engels, letter to Ferdinand Tönnies, 24th of January, 1895. Footnote. Engels' judgment upon Saint-Simonists that they bury Saint-Simon's fruitful ideas under a heap of rubbish and absurdities is not entirely correct. The doctrine of the Saint-Simonists embodied not only a systematization but also a considerable development of Saint-Simon's views, particularly in the field of economics. End footnote. Engels' admiration for Saint-Simon did not clash with his contempt for Comte because the main significance of Saint-Simon was, according to Engels, his philosophy of history, Saint-Simon's influence on the initial phases of the development of socialism, and Saint-Simon's eagerness to introduce the, quote, new age, end quote, that is, to establish a system of social organization appropriate for the industrial stage of civilization. Although Engels regarded Saint-Simon as a political thinker rather than a philosopher, he was at the same time inconsistently inclined to credit Saint-Simon with most, if not all, the philosophical ideas usually ascribed to Comte. Sorry, I just want to make sure I was recording. I have panic about not recording now. Most of the followers of Marx and Engels, especially the Russian wing, shared the feelings of the founders about Comte and Saint-Simon. See, for example, KSF entries. I guess this is like a Soviet encyclopedia for Comte and Saint-Simon for the evaluation of these two thinkers in contemporary Soviet philosophy. That Comte did not influence Marx and Engels is a view accepted by practically all exponents of their views. Karl Popper speaks of ample circumstantial evidence against the conjecture that Marx was affected directly by Comte. See Karl Popper, Open Society. The name of Comte is not even mentioned by Franz Mehring in his biography Karl Marx, or August Cornu in his detailed biographical study Karl Marx et Friedrich Engels. It is mentioned only once by Maximilien Rubel in his intellectual portrait Karl Marx, and there merely to say that Marx condemned Comtean positivism. See Maximilien Rubel, Karl Marx. I don't know if that's the same as Marx Without Myth, but I finished reading that book. The recordings are all done. I just got to put it up on the channel. Gustav Meyer, the biographer of Engels, denied by implication any connection between Comtean positivism and Engels' philosophical views. Engels, he wrote, did not know what to make of positive philosophy. See Gustav Meyer's Friedrich Engels. Only a handful of Marx's followers and commentators, notably an Austrian, Max Adler, an Italian, Antonio Labriola, and a Pole, Kazimierz Kraus, thought otherwise and recognized the existence of some connection between Comte and Marx.
Kazimierz Kraus. Kazimierz Kraus.
Kazimierz Kraus?
Kazimierz Kraus.
Kraus. I'll just say his last name. Wikipedia says Kazimierz Kraus was a Polish philosopher and sociologist, member of the Polish Socialist Party. He was one of the most significant Marxist thinkers at the end of the 17th century. Kraus was... and the internet crapped out. Thought otherwise and recognized the existence of some connection between Comte and Marx. Labriola showed as fierce a dislike of Comte as Marx did. It was Labriola who referred to Comte as, quote, that degenerate and reactionary disciple of the genial Saint-Simon, end quote. Antonio Labriola, Essays on the Materialist Conception of History. Labriola recognized, however, that Marx was influenced by positive philosophy. Quote, positivism, end quote, wrote Labriola, quote, has from its beginning walked at the heels of socialism. So far as the ideas are concerned, the two things were born about the same time in the vague mind of the genius Saint-Simon, end quote. Antonio Labriola, Socialism and Philosophy. Ever since, Labriola observed elsewhere, the positivists were sometimes our, quote, embarrassing guests, end quote, and sometimes our, quote, most open adversaries, end quote. The methodological affinity between Comte and Marx was undeniable. The materialist conception of history provides a verification of Comte's law of the three stages and, quote, marks the culminating point of the new tendency in the investigations of the historic social laws, end quote. It shows how human thought is gradually purified of theological and metaphysical conceptions and finally securely based on the prosaic assertion that, quote, in the interpretation of history, we must limit ourselves to the objective coordination of the determining conditions and of the determined effects, end quote. Labriola, Essays on the Materialist Conception of History. Kellis, Krauss, and Adler reached the same conclusion. Although Kellis-Krauss denied any actual connections between Comte's positivism and Marx's naturalism, he was fully aware of the numerous and essential affinities which he ascribed in Saint-Simon's influence on Marx. He said that the Marxian doctrine could justifiably be called, quote, social positivism, end quote, and deplored the ignorance and indifference of Marx's followers towards Comtean positivism. Adler disagreed with the view that the social theories of Marx were, quote, a variety of positivism, end quote, and asserted quite erroneously that the development of positivism did not precede but coincided with the development of Marx's thought. When Marx finished his doctoral dissertation, the 6 volumes of the Kur were already available in print. He was ready, however, to give Comte his due for his, quote, great idea of a positivistic conception of the spiritual life of humanity, end quote, and for renouncing the search after essences, efficient and final causes, which was to be replaced by a social science based on the observation of facts and the discovery of their invariable laws. Adler justly emphasized that Comte was satisfied with drawing up a general program only of how sociology could be made a positive science, and of how politics could become scientific by being supported by a social theory. It was Marx, however, who carried Comte's ideas into effect and thereby laid the foundation of modern sociology. A different development appeared among the Russian followers of Marx. Plekhanov fully accepted Engels' verdict on Saint-Simon and Comte. His adverse attitude to positivist philosophy, coupled with his Hegelizing interpretation of Marx, may have contributed to the intense hostility to positivism in Soviet Marxism later. Plekhanov's knowledge of Comte was limited and inaccurate, and he completely misunderstood Comte on some important points. Consequently, Plekhanov saw in the Comtean doctrine, quote, only an endless movement round a vicious circle, end quote, with, quote, no trace of science in it, end quote. Footnote: Plekhanov Plekhanov maintained, tried to base social physics on physiology, or in modern terminology, to reduce sociology to psychology. Plekhanov was completely unaware of the fact that Kant repeatedly criticized this reduction, which was advocated, for instance, by John Stuart Mill. Plekhanov's error can be found reproduced uncorrected in the evaluation of Comte in KSF. The entry, quote, Comte. End footnote. At the same time, he spoke with considerable knowledge and sympathy for Saint-Simon, whose works, like those of Fourier and Owen, were remarked for their, quote, profound thoughts, end quote. He ascribed to Saint-Simon the discoveries claimed by Comte as his exclusive possession, in particular the law of the 3 stages, and credited him with much insight and many new groundbreaking conceptions. Plekhanov agreed with Bernstein, whom he fought ruthlessly on other issues, that Saint-Simon and Saint-Simonists had left a definite impact on Marx's mind. It was Lenin who turned the scales decisively in Soviet Marxism and initiated its virulent philosophical and ideological hostility to positivism, a hostility different in kind and more extreme than Marx's. Lenin did not simply follow the patterns set up before him of piling high praise upon the genius of Saint-Simon and resounding denunciation upon the head of Comte. Lenin hardly associated the name of Comte with the establishment of a distinctive philosophical trend and was unable to differentiate Comtean positivism from the philosophy of other thinkers who came a little later, such as Herbert Spencer, the Neo-Kantians, Renouvier, and the French neo-criticist movement. Wikipedia says Charles Renouvier lived from 1815 to 1903 and was a French philosopher. He considered himself a, quote, Swedenborg of history, end quote, who sought to update the philosophy of Kantian liberalism and individualism for the socioeconomic realities of the late 19th century and influenced the sociological method of Émile Durkheim. Now the internet is working again. Kazimierz Kraus, who lived from 1872 to 1905, was a Polish philosopher and sociologist, member of the Polish Socialist Society. Kraus was one of the most significant Marxist thinkers at the end of the 19th century. Kraus was born in Zebrzyzn, Russian Empire, and died in Pernitz, Austria-Hungary. Kraus's greatest contribution to sociology is the, quote, law of retrospective revolution, end quote, according to which, quote, the ideals with which each reform movement tries to replace existing social norms are always similar to the norms of a more or less distant past, end quote. Yale's Timothy Snyder argues that Kraus, writing 2 decades before Hans Kohn and Carlton Hayes, ought to be among the small cluster of turn-of-the-century thinkers regarded as the pioneers of the modern study of nationalism. If you don't know, Timothy Snyder is a very important historian of Eastern Europe. He wrote a book called Bloodlands, which is very important. Let's see if anything comes up for the French neo-criticist movement. Not really seeing anything for that. Let me repeat the sentence that I was reading things from. Lenin associated the name of Comte with the establishment of a distinctive philosophical trend and was unable to differentiate Comtean positivism from the philosophy of other thinkers who came a little later, such as Herbert Spencer, the Neo-Kantians, Renouvier, and the French neo-criticist movement. He was, however, familiar with and interested in the philosophy of Ernst Mach, Henri Poincaré, Pierre Duhem, and Abel Rey, called, quote, the second positivism in the terminology of Soviet philosophy. I'm not going to look all those people up. I'm going to look some up. I'm going to look up Pierre Duhem because I've never heard that name before. And I'm going to look up Abel Rey, who I've never heard before. According to Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which may or may not work. Motherfucker. Anyway, I'll just keep reading the text and maybe later I'll be able to return to these names. Lenin was, however, familiar with and interested in the philosophy of Ernst Mach, Henri Poincaré, Pierre Duhem, and Abel Rey, called, quote, the second positivism in the terminology of Soviet philosophy. Alright, it looks like the Pierre Duhem entry has come up. Pierre Duhem lived from 1861 to 1916 and was a French physicist and historian and philosopher of science. As a physicist, he championed, quote, energetics, end quote, holding generalized thermodynamics as foundational for physical theory. That is, thinking that all of chemistry and physics, including mechanics, electricity, and magnetism, should be derived from thermodynamic first principles. In philosophy of science, he is best known for his work on the relation between theory and experiment, arguing that hypotheses are not straightforwardly refuted by experiment, and that there are no crucial experiments in science. In history of science, he produced massive, groundbreaking work in medieval science and defended a thesis of continuity between medieval and early modern science. Is he the guy who's like isn't there like a thing called like the Duhem-Quine thesis? I don't know. But Wikipedia says Abel Rey lived from 1873 to 1940 and was a French philosopher and historian of science. Abel Rey succeeded Gaston Milhaud, I don't know how to say that name, as professor of history of philosophy in its relation to science at the Sorbonne, and established the Institut d'Histoire des Sciences et des Techniques to encourage cooperation between the sciences and humanities. It was argued that Rey influenced Philipp Frank and the formation of the Vienna Circle. Abel Rey's history of science was wide, including sciences from physics to sociology, and deep, ranging from antiquity to the present. Moreover, it included the study of culture's influence on the sciences of the time. Back to the text. It was the second positivism on which Lenin concentrated his scornful and abusive attitude. Lenin's condemnation of Mach's philosophy was based on its interpretation as a kind of subjective idealism. According to Lenin, Mach believed that the world consists of sensations or perceptions or sense data. Lenin deduced this assertion from the methodological demand common to the first and second positivism, that statements in which constructs such as energy, force, or mass occur cannot be literally true unless they are translatable into statements about sense observations. Footnote. As far as Comte is concerned, see Coeur and Frank, Modern Science and its Philosophy. End footnote. If the philosophy of Mach was idealistic, then every kind of positivism was tarred with the same brush. Lenin's militant hostility towards the second positivism was accepted by Marxist-Leninists and extended to the third positivism, i.e. to logical positivism and logical empiricism, with which British analytical philosophy and American philosophy of science is sometimes mentioned in one breath. Footnote. The expression, quote, second positivism, end quote, and, quote, third positivism, end quote, are to be found, for instance, in the Soviet encyclopedia. At least I'm assuming that's what that KSF stands for. See the entry, positivism. End footnote. Since the second and third positivism are historically related to the positivism of Comte, Lenin and Marxist-Leninists refused to recognize any connection between Marx and French positivism. An ideological critique reinforced the epistemological refutation of positivism. Marxist-Leninists look at the relation of Marx to Comte in the light of the present historical situation and believe that the sociology of the 19th and 20th centuries has developed in anticipation of and in opposition to the theory and practice of modern revolutionary socialism. From this point of view, bourgeois sociology is mere ideology and a weapon in the class struggle raging throughout the world. This precludes a priori any link between the doctrines of Comte and Marx. It is self-evident that Marx could not have anything in common with the founders of sociology and his, quote, philosophy of acceptance, end quote, which expressed and supported the interests of the victorious bourgeoisie of the 19th century. Footnote. Some revisionist exponents of Marx's philosophy also subscribe to the ideological critique of positivism. See Karl Kautsky's Karl Marx. The view that sociology is nothing but the ideology of contemporary bourgeois societies was the starting point of violent attacks upon sociology and its complete suppression in the Stalinist period. Philip Frank completely misunderstood both the content and the ideological aspect of dialectical materialism when he suggested that it was closely related to positivism and pragmatism, and that its twofold opposition to idealism and mechanistic materialism could be carried on consistently only from the viewpoint of modern positivism. End footnote. I don't know if I said end footnote or not. While Marx and Engels, giving free vent to their ideological idiosyncrasy, minimized the philosophical significance of Comte and maximized the political importance of Saint-Simon, the role of positivism in the formation of their philosophy was disappearing from sight. Although in the first generation of the followers of Marx and Engels, there were some writers who tried to elevate the part played by positivism impartially. The repudiation of positivism became absolute, with Lenin and its influence upon Marx's philosophy was denied altogether. A number of Western commentators tried to investigate the relation of Marx and Engels to positivism, but they all failed to establish their case for one reason or another. Footnote: see P. Barth, Die Philosophie der Geschichte als Soziologie, and Werner Sombart, Der proletarische Sozialismus. End footnote. Although it appears certain that Marx read Cours de philosophie positive, only in his mature years the view that there is no connection between the philosophy of Marx and Comte and positivism cannot be upheld. Marx did not need to study the classical formulation of the first positivism to be influenced by positivism, because the Cours was neither the first nor the only source from which its basic ideas could be learnt. As will be seen presently, Marx became acquainted with positive philosophy and other doctrines of Saint-Simon and Comte at an early age and before his own philosophy was formulated. It should be borne in mind that the Cours de philosophie positive It should be borne in mind that the Cours de philosophie positive, quote, very near the grandest work of the age, end quote, as John Stuart Mill described it, was slow in gaining prominence in France and elsewhere. Footnote: John Stuart Mill's letter to Alexander Bain of the 15th of October 1841, quoted in I.W. Mueller's John Stuart Mill and French Thought. In an essay written nearly a quarter of a century later, Mill described Comte as, quote, one of the principal thinkers of the age, end quote. Auguste Comte and Positivism, end footnote. Upon its first publication, the Cours was received with more sympathy in England than in Comte's native land, and in both countries it was known and appreciated by only a handful of individuals. Footnote: it is significant that in his celebrated work, Der Sozialismus und Kommunismus des heutigen Frankreichs, first published in 1842, Lorenz von Stein passed over Comte in silence, although Saint-Simon and the Saint-Simonists were considered at length. Karl Grun, in a similar work published in 1845, referred to Comte once to say that Comte, quote, has just published a rather large work in the field of science of government, Ein grosseres staatswissenschaftliches Werk, under the title Positive Philosophy, end quote. Die soziale Bewegung in Frankreich und Belgien. To judge from the misleading content of this remark, Grun himself could not have been familiar with Comte's work. No wide interest in Comte's work among the French and English reading public was aroused until the publication of its second edition in 1864. The popularity of positivism in the wider meaning of this term reached its high water mark only in the last 2 decades of the 19th century. Footnote. See D.G. Carlton, Positivist Thought in France, and W.M. Simon, European Positivism in the 19th Century. End footnote. Marx was not among the handful of people in France and elsewhere who read the Cours when it first came out. One of Marx's letters to Engels seems to have little doubt that Marx read it only in 1866, that is, when the publication of the second edition caused considerable stir in France and England and prompted him to study it. Footnote. Marx's letter to Engels, 25th of July, 1866. End footnote. Marx's first knowledge of positivism came from his reading of Saint-Simon and the Saint-Simonists, for which the German ideology provides direct and ample evidence. This work makes it clear that Marx's knowledge of the Saint-Simonist doctrine was based on the original works of Saint-Simon and his followers, and not on second-hand sources. Footnote. References to Saint-Simon can also be found in economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844 in the Holy Family. G. Gouvreich, La Vocation Actuelle de la Sociologie, Tome 2, detecting an unacknowledged quotation from Saint-Simon in Marx's The Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right. End footnote. Footnote. The German ideology conclusively establishes the fact that prior to 1845, Marx studied Let d'un habitant de Genève, Saint-Simon's famous journalistic ventures, La Industrie, La Organisateur, and Catéchisme des Industriels, and Le Nouveau Christianisme. Marx was also familiar with the interpretation given to the doctrine of Saint-Simon by his followers, above all by Bazard and Enfantin in Les Producteurs and Les Globes, and with the Exposition de la Doctrine de Saint-Simon, prepared by his disciples in 1829. End footnote. Footnote. The most important second-hand sources at the time were the above-quoted books of Lorenz von Stein and Karl Grun, and Études sur les réformateurs ou socialistes modernes by Louis Reybau. Marx referred to all these works in the German ideology. End footnote. Moreover, there is some evidence that Marx might have made his first acquaintance with the doctrine of Saint-Simon very early and at the most impressionable age of his life. He might have come across Saint-Simon's ideas when he was still at school in Trier through Ludwig Gall, a local celebrity who greatly admired Saint-Simon and published a pamphlet about his teaching in 1834. It looks like Ludwig Gall is not someone with a lot of biographical information, but there is like in terms of like easy access, but there does seem to be papers about him. Marx certainly heard of Saint-Simon from his paternal friend and future father-in-law, Ludwig von Westphalen. Ludwig von Westphalen lived from 1770 to 1842, was a liberal Prussian civil servant and father-in-law of Karl Marx. Marx certainly would have learned of Saint-Simon from his paternal friend and future father-in-law. Another admirer of Saint-Simon was Edward Gans, the journalist, one of his teachers at the University of Berlin, who reputedly influenced his intellectual development. I think he's kind of like, I think Edward Gans is like I might have said this already in other videos from this, but it seems like Edward Gans was kind of like a liberal interpreter of Hegel. Yeah. There's nothing really about him online. It just says Edward Gans lived from 1797 to 1839 and was a German jurist. Anyway, let me reread that sentence. Marx certainly heard of Saint-Simon from his paternal friend and future father-in-law, Ludwig von Westphalen, another admirer of Saint-Simon, and from Edward Gans, the jurist, one of his teachers at the University of Berlin, who reputedly influenced Marx's intellectual development. Finally, Marx most certainly became familiar with Saint-Simon through Moses Hess, whom he met first in 1841, and with whom he worked on the Rheinische Zeitung in the years 1842 to 43. The Rheinische Zeitung was a 19th century German newspaper edited most famously by Karl Marx. The Rheinische Zeitung was launched in January 1842 and terminated by Prussian state censorship in March 1843. The Rheinische Zeitung was eventually succeeded by a daily newspaper launched by Karl Marx on behalf of the Communist League in June 1948 called the Neue Rheinische Zeitung. Alright, back to the text. Footnote. See A. Cornu, Marx et Friedrich Engels, Tome 1. The name of Saint-Simon turns up repeatedly in Die Europäische Triarchie, published in 1841, where Hess compares his social role in France with that of Hegel in Germany, and in Hess's articles of 1843, Sozialismus und Kommunismus and Philosophie der Tat. The above-quoted works of Hess are reprinted in Moses Hess Philosophische und Socialistische Schriften, 1837 to 1850. End footnote. Besides, after France, it was Germany where the Saint-Simonist doctrine gained the greatest foothold. In the early 1830s, so many books, pamphlets, and articles about Saint-Simonist doctrine appeared there that practically everything could be learnt about it from German sources. Footnote. F.A. Hayek, The Counter-Revolution of Science, and G. Gurvitch, La vocation actuelle de la sociologie, Tome 2. End footnote. Among the Saint-Simonist writings, which Marx was most likely to have studied at first hand, none was more important than Comte's early contribution to the positivist doctrine, Système de politique positive, known also under the cumbersome title Plan des travaux scientifiques nécessaires pour réorganiser la société, published during Saint-Simon's lifetime in his Catéchisme des Industriels in 1822. Footnote. Catéchisme des Industriels is quoted in the German ideology. Comte's Système de politique positive of 1822 should not be confused with the 4-volume work under the same title published in 1851-54. The reason for the double title is explained by F.E. Manuel, The New World of Henri Saint-Simon. It was this essay that enormously impressed John Stuart Mill, who considered it far superior to other Saint-Simonian writings, or Saint-Simonist writings. Although he lost sight of Comte for a number of years, Mill then continued to read everything the Saint-Simonists wrote. End footnote. Comte's long article contains a concise and clear exposition of his main philosophical and sociological ideas, later expounded in great detail in the Cours. F.A. Hayek suggested that it reached a much earlier and wider audience than the Cours did after its first publication and exercised, therefore, a greater influence than Comte's classical work did, at least at first. Quote, "It seems to me to be one of the most pregnant tracts of the 19th century, infinitely more brilliant than the better-known ponderous volumes of the Cours." End quote. F.A. Hayek, The Counter-Revolution of Science. Since Comte described himself in his article, which appeared in Saint-Simon's publication, as a, quote, pupil of Saint-Simon, end quote, whose ideas Comte, quote, tried to systematize, to develop, and to improve, end quote, his readers, including Marx, may have failed to differentiate Comte's views from the vaguely defined body of ideas known as the Saint-Simonist doctrine. It was possible, therefore, for Marx to borrow ideas from Comte's contribution without giving him credit for them, and to praise Saint-Simon for the ideas which are actually Comte's. 2. New section. The positivistic background of Marxian philosophy. The relation of Marx and Engels to Comte closely resembles their relation to Hegel. While Comte's, quote, brilliant ideas, end quote, appear plainly and clearly in the philosophy of Engels, in Marx's case the Comtean influence can only be established indirectly. This influence is revealed by a considerable number of sociological and historical conceptions which Marx held in common with Saint-Simon and Comte, and which seem to preclude a mere chance similarity emanating from the prevailing climate of philosophical opinions. However, Marx not only absorbed but also elaborated upon these conceptions, and having looked deeper into the structure of society and discovered in its textures some connections that escaped the notice of either Saint-Simon or Comte, Marx transcended the views which he adopted from them. The belief that French positivism exercised a lasting influence upon Marx does not entail the conclusion that the Marxian doctrine is nothing but a variant of positivism. It is true that l'esprit positif never gained ground in Germany. Quote, in Germany, whose scholastic atmosphere was always inimical toward anything that could be called positivism, Lange tried, to a very modest extent, to propagate understanding of Comte and Mill, but the effect was quite unexpected. It caused a reaction which opposed the, quote, undue prevalence of the ideas of natural science, end quote, and proclaimed a, quote, autarky of the humanities, Geisteswissenschaften, end quote, end quote. However, footnote, R. von Mises, Positivism, end footnote. However, in Germany it was not Comte but Marx who became the embodiment of l'esprit positif in the social and historical sciences, as the names of Ferdinand Tönnies, Rudolf Stammler, Werner Sombart, Max Weber, Ernst Troeltsch, Max Scheler, or Karl Mannheim testify. Many developments in the theory and methodology of the historical and social sciences, which elsewhere would have been related to positivism, to the positivism of Comte in one way or another, should be tracked back in Germany to the impact of the theories of Marx. If I look up all these people, we'd be here till doomsday. So I'm not going to. If they show up again, I'll look them up. Although Marx appears to have performed the same function in Germany as Comte did in other European countries, the identity of function should not be confused with the identity of views. Today, probably nobody would endorse the verdict of Paul Barth to the effect that Marx contributed nothing to the naturalistic or positivistic conception of history, but merely systematized the ideas of Saint-Simon and Louis Blanc, especially those concerned with the function of technology and the role of class struggle in social development, infusing them with a certain Hegelian speculative drive. Footnote: P. Barth, or Paul Barth, Die Philosophie der Geschichte als Soziologie. End footnote. Paul Barth was a sociologist who lived from 1858 to 1922, known simply as Paul Barth, was a German sociologist and philosopher. Okay. And Louis Blanc is Louis Blanc, who lived from 1811 to 1882, was a French socialist politician, journalist, and historian. He called for the creation of cooperatives in order to guarantee employment for the urban poor. Although Blanc's ideas of the workers' cooperatives were never realized, Louis Blanc's political and social ideas greatly contributed to the development of socialism in France. Louis Blanc wanted the government to encourage cooperatives and replace capitalist enterprises. These cooperatives were to be associations of people who produced together and divided the profit accordingly. Following the Revolution of 1848, Blanc became a member of the provisional government and began advocating for cooperatives which would be initially aided by the government but ultimately controlled by the workers themselves. Louis Blanc's advocacy failed. Caught between radical worker tendencies and the National Guard, Louis Blanc was forced into exile. Louis Blanc returned to France in 1870, shortly before the conclusion of the Franco-Prussian War, where Louis Blanc served as a member of the National Assembly for the Seine. While Louis Blanc did not support the Paris Commune, Louis Blanc successfully proposed amnesty to the communards. Back to the text. This is not only... so let me repeat what was just said. Today, probably nobody would endorse the verdict of Paul Barth to the effect that Marx contributed nothing to the naturalistic or positivistic conception of history, but merely systematized the ideas of Saint-Simon and Louis Blanc, especially those concerned with the function of technology and the role of class struggle in social development, infusing them with a certain Hegelian speculative drive. This is not only a greatly exaggerated but also an erroneous opinion, for Marx did incorporate certain views of Saint-Simon into his own system, but not without first adapting them to his own way of perceiving social reality. For instance, both Saint-Simon and Marx emphasized the importance of economic change, but Saint-Simon regarded economic change as a dependent and Marx as an independent variable. For Saint-Simon, the primary cause of progress was the accumulation and advancement of knowledge. Economic change, the accumulation and advancement of knowledge's effect. For Marx, economic change was the source of all progress, including the accumulation and advancement of knowledge. In spite of Marx and Saint-Simon's similarity in some respects, the doctrines of Saint-Simon and Marx remained essentially different. To establish the difference of one thinker upon another, to establish the influence of one thinker upon another thinker, or to discover an affinity in their views does not entail the conclusion that only one of them should be credited with original and significant ideas. Saint-Simon showed a lively interest in history and made a significant contribution to the philosophical study of this subject. Saint-Simon held a poor opinion of the historiography of his time because the historiography of Saint-Simon's time had not yet abandoned, as Saint-Simon put it, the language of infancy. It was the mere story of the founders of religions, sages, kings, or conquerors who could do with society whatever they pleased, a mere collection of facts which were not linked together by a theory. Since the historians failed to discover, quote, the cause of the order of events, end quote, historians were unable to provide, quote, the means of judging what will happen from what has happened, end quote. The fact that historiography was not in a position to predict the future was the best indication that historiography could not be classified among the positive sciences. Footnote. Henri Saint-Simon, Mémoire sur la science de l'homme. End footnote. Saint-Simon was anxious to remedy its defects and produced a philosophy of history which was destined to play an important role in the further development of ideas. Comte adopted and amplified Saint-Simon's philosophy in his own view of history, and Marx was also affected by Saint-Simon's philosophy in many ways. The number of ideas common to the Saint-Simonian and Marxian conception of history is considerable. Both Saint-Simon and Marx considered history as a succession of developmental phases which is subject to invariable laws and which the human species has to pass through in its advance. The very subject of social science is to discover the laws of progress, that is, to investigate the necessary order of the successive stages of social evolution and the contribution of each of them to the determination of the following ones. The law of progress relates the different forms of civilization and explains how each of them was brought about by or gave rise to another, for a social system is always formed in the bosom of the preceding one. However antagonistic the two social systems might be or actually are, one does not create or abolish a system of social organization. One simply discovers that system of social organization's formation or disappearance. Quote, a social system, end quote, Saint-Simon observed, and Marx reproduced Saint-Simon's remarks in the preface to A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy in almost identical words, can only disappear to the extent that another already exists entirely formed and ready to take its place immediately. End quote. I don't know if I said the first quote. Quote, can only disappear to the extent that another already exists entirely formed and ready to take its place immediately. End quote. Since peoples move towards the same goal and follow the same necessary course of evolution, which no force can change or resist, the knowledge of the law of progress can merely, quote, explain a development which is inevitable, end quote, help to remove the obstacle barring its advance, and persuade people to, quote, do consciously and with better direct and more useful efforts what they have hitherto done unconsciously, slowly, indecisively, and too inefficiently, end quote. As Saint-Simon wrote elsewhere, the law of progress of the human spirit, quote, carries along and dominates everything. Men are but the law of progress of the human spirit. The law of progress of the human spirit's instruments. ... All we can do is obey this law of progress of the human spirit by accounting for the course the law of progress of the human spirit directs, instead of being pushed by the law of progress of the human spirit, end quote. The first intimation of the Marxian vision of social development is a lawful process which unfolds itself, quote, with iron necessity towards inevitable results, end quote, whose successive stages cannot be cleared by bold leaps, and whose pangs of birth and growth can be only lessened or shortened by conscious action, is to be found in Saint-Simon. Footnote. Saint-Simon, l'industrie, l'organisateur, and see Emile Durkheim, Socialism and Saint-Simon. Excuse me. End footnote. Like many others, including Marx, Saint-Simon emphasized that the discovery of the laws of social evolution was important not only for the purpose of acquiring knowledge, but also and above all for the perfection of civilization. The knowledge of laws enables us to grasp the causes of events and to predict what will happen in the future. It gives us, therefore, the power to influence events and provides the means of turning them to the advantage of man. Quote, The true intelligence, the positive intelligence, is revealed in the prediction of the march of events in which one is involved, in the knowledge of how to protect oneself from those which might be harmful and of how to profit by those which might be advantageous." End quote. Footnote. Henri Simon, Mémoire sur la science de l'homme. Ainsi, l'être d'un habitant de Genève, Selected Writings. End footnote. Finally, for Saint-Simon, historical inevitability was a beneficial force, and, quote, "the march of the human spirit," end quote, was destined to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number. The law of progress was bound to bring out what ought to be, another conception, or rather preconception, common to Marx and Saint-Simon. Both believed that social evolution leads, one way or another, to the progressive emancipation of men from all forms of degrading dependence upon each other, promotes the growth of cooperative association and social solidarity, allows men to make the most of their natural capacities, to abandon their distinctively human to expand their distinctively human potentialities and to live a satisfying life. In disregard of what he said about historical inevitability, but in keeping with his earlier beliefs, Saint-Simon urged his fellow men to create a new society of by conscious effort. The main theme of Le Nouveau Christianisme was that society should be organized in a manner most advantageous to the largest number, and that all human work should be directed into the amelioration, as prompt and complete as possible, of the moral and physical conditions of existence of the most numerous and most suffering class. Footnote. Henri Simon, Le Nouveau Christianisme, Selected Writings, C. Durkheim, Socialism and Saint-Simon. End footnote. In his lectures on the Saint-Simonist doctrine, Armand Bassard drew the consequences implicit in Saint-Simon's exhortations. Let's see if there's anything for Armand Bassard. Apparently, it's not Armand Bassard, it's Armand. Saint-Armand Bassard lived from 1791 to 1832, was a French socialist, the founder of a secret society in France corresponding to the Carabinieri of Italy. End footnote. In his lectures on the Saint-Simonist doctrine, Armand Bassard drew the consequences implicit in Saint-Simon's exhortations. Bassard condemned the anarchy of capitalist production, the disastrous effect of free competition, and the injustice of the monopoly of wealth. Bassard compared the, quote, exploitation of man by man, end quote, to slavery in the ancient world, and demanded that exploitation of man by man be replaced by the, quote, exploitation of nature by man associated with man, end quote. Each man should be placed, quote, according to his capability, end quote, and rewarded, quote, according to his work, end quote. The rights of property which allow some to impose a levy on the labor of others and live in idleness must be changed. The human race is becoming more and more unified, and humanity is gravitating to, quote, universal association, end quote. These formulations strike familiar chords, for Marx incorporated them into his own view of society and social evolution. As a social and political philosopher, Marx owed more to Saint-Simon and the Saint-Simonists than to any other of his socialist forerunners. Footnote. See J. Plemenot's Man in Society. For details, see Durkheim, Socialism, and Saint-Simon, whose exposition of the Saint-Simonist doctrine remains unsurpassed. End footnote. For Saint-Simon, sociology and philosophy were so intimately connected that it was almost impossible to separate sociology and philosophy from each other. Footnote. Saint-Simon used the term, quote, social physiology, end quote, quote, physiology of the human species, end quote, or, quote, science of man, end quote, to designate sociology. Quote, social physics, end quote, is an expression introduced by Comte. End footnote. The bond between philosophy and sociology could be explained by the fact that philosophy and sociology both were concerned with the same subject matter, differing only in their respective approach and procedure. It was the very object of philosophy to systematize the whole of knowledge available at a given time, and of sociology to study the same body of knowledge, quote, in action, end quote, and as reflected in social life. Saint-Simon believed that what unites men in society was a common way of perceiving and reacting to the world, and consequently that all human society was grounded on a system of collectively held fundamental opinions. Religion, politics, morality, or education were simply, quote, applications of a system of ideas, end quote, prevailing at a given period. Footnote. Henri Saint-Simon, Mémoire sur les sciences de l'homme. End footnote. But if every social order is the embodiment of a philosophical system, sociology is a branch of philosophy, and philosophy has a social significance and practical implications. To speak in the language of the young Hegelians used by Marx in Marx's youth, philosophy is realized in the corresponding social order. We cannot abolish an old society and institute a new one without first establishing a new philosophical system, for the one is an implication of the other. Comte adopted the Saint-Simonist conception of the relation between philosophy and sociology, but with an important difference. Comte insisted that philosophy must be clearly separated from sociology, and social theory from applied social science. From the viewpoint of positive philosophy, these distinctions were essential. In his first major work, Système de politique positive, of 1822, Comte criticized Saint-Simon without mentioning Saint-Simon for Saint-Simon's failure to differentiate between social theory and social theory's application, to the disadvantage of both social theory and social theory's application. As a qualifying term, quote, positive, end quote, was to indicate the transformation of knowledge from the speculative to the scientific stage, when facts, instead of being explained a priori by means of personified abstractions, quote, become connected by general ideas or laws of a completely positive kind, suggested or confirmed by the very facts, end quote. Footnote. Comte. SPP, and I don't remember what that stands for. System of Positive Philosophy, maybe? That's what it stands for. Anyway, end footnote. In every branch of knowledge that reaches the scientific or positive stage of development, a clear and sharp distinction between that branch of knowledge's theoretical and practical functions is of utmost importance. While objecting to Saint-Simon's haste in applying a science which did not yet exist, Comte did not repudiate Saint-Simon's ultimate objective, which, however, was to be attained by the prior establishment of sociology as a positive theoretical science. It was the Comtean conception of social physics rather than the Saint-Simonist social physiology as a kind of applied philosophy that influenced Marx. It is in his determination to apply scientific method to social life, to discover invariable laws to which social phenomena conform, and to establish a science of society, that Marx is most clearly indebted to the Comtean methodological and sociological conception, since it was the sociological approach to intellectual and moral phenomena that enabled Marx to move beyond the old materialism and to formulate a consistent naturalistic outlook, the influence of French positivism is of crucial importance in the development of Marxian thought. To say that Comte had, quote, the disdain for truth in itself, end quote, seems to be an observation overreaching its evidence and at best misleading. Footnote. D.G. Charlton, Positivist Thought in France. See F.A. Hayek, The Counter-Revolution of Science. Comte did say in a youthful letter quoted by F.A. Hayek that he held in a supreme aversion all scientific work of which he did not see any utility, but he did not specify that it must be a practical utility. Only in his capacity of the high priest of humanity, Comte showed an increasing dislike of all purely intellectual pursuits and tended to subordinate the search for truth to human use. End footnote. Both Comte and Marx shared the conception of science known as, quote, instrumentalism, end quote. Comte and Marx did not value knowledge for knowledge's own sake, but as a necessary condition of man's control over his natural and social environment. True knowledge is useful because true knowledge gives us the power of prediction, and prediction provides the basis for intelligent action. The instrumentalism of Marx, and especially of Comte, can be traced back to Francis Bacon, whom the encyclopedist, Comte's direct intellectual predecessors, admired perhaps more than any other philosopher of the past. Bacon encouraged men to acquire knowledge, for knowledge is power over nature, which in turn increases human happiness. Quote, hostile to systems, end quote, wrote D'Alembert of Bacon, quote, Bacon conceives of philosophy as being only that part of our knowledge which should contribute to making us better or happier, thus confining it within the limits of the science of useful things, end quote. This seems to refer to Jean Le Rond d'Alembert, who lived from 1717 to 1783 and was a French mathematician, mechanician, physicist, philosopher, and music theorist. Until 1759, Alembert was, together with Denis Diderot, a co-editor of the Encyclopedia. D'Alembert's formula for obtaining solutions to the wave equation is named after him. The wave equation is sometimes referred to as D'Alembert's equation, and the fundamental theorem of algebra is named after D'Alembert in French. End footnote. I mean, not end footnote, but back to the text. Footnote. D'Alembert, Preliminary Discourse to the Encyclopedia of Diderot. End footnote. One need not feel disdain for truth if one assumes that knowledge is practical power and urges men to use it for their own benefit. Apart from Bacon or Comte, many philosophers have been more interested in human morality and happiness than in knowledge for knowledge's own sake. It is perhaps unwise to be too unfavorably impressed by such attitudes. As Bertrand Russell observed, a pure desire for knowledge which only philosophy can give is extremely rare. Kant had to admit, however, that the possibility of exerting influence upon the forces of nature is very small, for they operate according to laws over which we have no control. Our entire power lies in the discovery of these laws through observation and in the prediction of what happens in conformity to the inevitable succession of events. Comte emphasized that this applied to political action in the same way and for the same reason as to physical, chemical, or physiological phenomena. Quote, all political action is followed by a real and durable result, when it is exerted in the same direction as the force of civilization and aims at producing changes which the latter necessitates, end quote. Kant added that, quote, On every other hypothesis, it exerts no influence or a merely ephemeral influence." End quote. That the function of knowledge, both in natural and social science, is, quote, "to reveal the future," end quote, is a view which deeply impressed both Marx and Engels. That the function of knowledge, both in natural and social science, is to, quote, "reveal the future," impressed Marx and Engels because of its obvious relevance for natural theology and philosophical anthropology. Comte insisted throughout the cours that the principle of rational prediction was, quote, "the most unchallengeable criterion of scientific positiveness," end quote. "Le plus irrécursable critérium de la positivité scientifique." Our power of foreseeing phenomena is closely connected with our power of controlling them. And these two powers together do away with the belief that the external world is governed by a supernatural will. When men learn how to predict and control the phenomena of nature, the theological mode of thought cannot last out much longer. Although the principle of rational prediction is compatible with the belief in a supreme intelligence, provided that this intelligence adheres to invariable laws, both Marx and Engels were inclined to think that it helped to get rid of it. The predictive power of positive science also had important implications for man's views about man's self and man's place in nature. The predictive power of positive science inspired Engels with a boundless confidence in the efficacy of collective action, and prompted Engels' statement that men are in a position to exercise control, founded on knowledge of natural necessity, over their destiny, and over the external world by making natural laws, quote, "work towards definite ends," end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Since man is powerless if man does not act in conformity to the laws of nature, Marx regarded as utopian any social science which, instead of being supported by the law of social evolution, was based on moral considerations alone, or the principle of justice, or the ideals of an unchanging human nature. The concept of prediction sharply differentiates the Comtean and the Hegelian views of progress, which otherwise evince a certain similarity. Both Hegel and Comte take progress for granted, assume that progress is a process determined by law, and believe that this law that determines both Hegel and Comte take progress for granted, assume that progress is a process determined by law, and believe that this law becomes manifest in the advance of the mind or spirit. Footnote. See D.G. Charlton, Positivist Thought in France. End footnote. But Hegel did not see any connection between prediction and progress, or between prediction and effective action. This is the meaning frequently attached to the oracular saying about the owl of Minerva spreading the owl of Minerva's wings only with the fall of dusk. While for Hegel progress represented an aspect of spirit and disclosed an essential characteristic of the absolute, for Kant progress reflected the changes in man and society, and revealed the fact that in each successive age the main social phenomena were different from what they were in the preceding age. While Hegel could only point retrospectively to the unfolding of an ideal slowly embodying that ideal self in the actual form of historical cultures, the Comtean law of progress provided a means of interpreting the past and predicting the future in order that man might increasingly improve the organization of society. Leopold von Ranke's celebrated pronouncement that every epoch is directly related to God, and that epoch's value does not lie in what that epoch engenders, but in what that epoch is, that epoch's own self, could well be fitted into the Hegelian conception of progress, but not within that of Comte or Marx. There can be no doubt that Comte, rather than Hegel, affected Marx's views about progress and the role of prediction in its realization. The recognition of social laws which dominate social life imposes far-reaching limitations upon the effectiveness of human action. According to Kant, the progress of civilization is essentially unalterable. Man's interference can modify it only in certain respects and within certain limits. The modification brought about by man's intervention cannot, for instance, reverse the natural course of development, nor take a leap forward, nor avoid any intermediate phases in the fixed succession of evolutionary stages. The natural progress of civilization determines for each epoch the improvements of which society is susceptible, and only such improvements can in fact be attained by conscious effort. Human actions may accelerate or retard the speed of change, but human action cannot affect change's nature and direction. To use John Stuart Mill's expression, Comte's principle of social determinism gives, quote, a scientific shape, end quote, to the view originally formulated by Saint-Simon, and brings to focus the affinity between the Saint-Simonist and the Marxian conception of social change. By the same token, it throws doubt upon the statement often regarded as self-evident, that it was Hegel alone who was responsible for the Marxian way of thinking of society in terms of change, evolution, and invariable laws. Comte's social dynamics, as the science of the continuous movement and lawful transformation of humanity from one state into another, could have influenced Marx as much as Hegel's conceptions. Footnote. A more detailed definition of social dynamics is to be found only in the Cours 4, page 310, blah, blah, blah. It is foreshadowed, however, by what Comte had to say about social change. End footnote. Indeed, when Marx speaks of the, quote, successive phases of normal social development, end quote, or of, quote, the laws of motion of modern society, end quote, he speaks clearly in the language of Comte, not Hegel. Comte's concept of social evolution is modeled on the process of biological development. Comte spoke of social evolution as a fixed course of change determined exclusively by the causes inherent in the nature of changing society. Social change is not induced from outside, but self-generated. It results from socially determined activities and is itself, therefore, socially determined, quote, a spontaneous social movement ruled by natural laws, end quote. Un mouvement social spontané et réglé par les lois naturelles, as Comte insisted in the Cours. Society evolves in the same way as a plant develops from a seed or an animal from an embryo or a man from a child, an image that also underlies the 17th and 18th century conception of human progress. Footnote. J.B. Bury, The Idea of Progress. End footnote. Comte ignored the possibility that social evolution might be likened to a process of growth determined both by internal and external factors, and thus modifiable by innumerable favorable or unfavorable circumstances, of which the socialization of children, the learning of skills, the improvement of tools, or the cultivation of abilities provide instances. Comte clearly thought in biological rather than in non-biological, cultural, or sociological terms. When Marx spoke of society discovering, quote, the natural laws of society's movement, end quote, or, quote, the successive phases of society's normal development, end quote, Marx made use of the Comtean biological concept of evolution. Marx's formulation suggests that the normal development of society is a process of change independent of any external factors and taking place in conformity to an invariable law. Marx explained that in Capital, the book, Marx used England as the chief illustration of the capitalist mode of production because England was its, quote, classic ground, end quote, and thus permitted Marx to study the, quote, occurrence of the phenomena in the phenomena's normality, end quote. Marx pointed out that other nations could and should learn from England's example what the future holds in store for them. Marx denied, however, that by taking advantage of his knowledge, other nations could spare themselves the experience. To those doubting the truth of this statement, he answered, quote, De te fabula narratur, end quote. Footnote, Marx Capital, Volume 1. The instrumental conception of knowledge common to Comte and Marx accounts for yet another resemblance between their respective views. Comte did not deny that the search for knowledge is inherent in the human mind, but he emphasized the intimate relation between knowledge, forecast, and action. Quote, science hence foresight, foresight hence action, end quote. Footnote. Comte, Coeur. It becomes more evident every day. Comte wrote, how hopeless the task of reconstructing political institutions is without the prior remodeling of beliefs and of life. Philosophy was to secure the foundations for morality and religion, and these were to provide the basis for scientific politics and the reorganization of society. Thus, philosophy positive was not an autonomous but a heteronymous end, that is, a means for the attainment of an end. Quote, had Comte thought it possible to reorganize society without first reorganizing morals, and to reorganize morals without first reorganizing beliefs, he would not perhaps have written the 6 volumes of the Cours de Philosophie Positive, ... He would have gone straight to what was of supreme interest, end quote. That's from L. Lévi-Bruhl, The Philosophy of Auguste Comte. Saint-Simon, I don't know if I said end footnote or even if I said footnote initially, but back to the text. Either way, Saint-Simon, the Saint-Simonists, and Comte were as much social reformers as they were social philosophers. They saw in knowledge a basis for action and a guide to social reconstruction. They felt that a comprehensive historical and sociological theory, which provides a way of viewing the world and a code of life, precepts, was indispensable in their task. In both these respects, Marx shows an essential similarity to his positivist predecessors. There is a close parallel between Saint-Simon's demand for a new philosophy, of which the society of the future would be an application, or Comte's insistence that only a comprehensive and coherent system of positive science could provide the foundation for the establishment of a stable social order, and Marx's statement that philosophy was the head of man's political and social emancipation, and the proletariat its heart. The last thesis on Feuerbach epitomizes Marx's overriding concern with social reconstruction, of which a philosophical Weltanschauung was an indispensable prerequisite. Comte claimed that Kant founded social physics or sociology by extending the positive mode of thought to moral and social phenomena, which had previously been studied according to the theologico-metaphysical mode. As Kant pointed out, prior to his own investigations, quote, imagination was not subordinate to observation, end quote. In the study of social facts, the facts themselves were considered to be modifiable, practically without restriction by the action of the ruler or the legislator. The social phenomena were explained by means of mental abstractions which, being conceived as real entities, could exert power and produce change. A science is positive if it does not ask the question why something happens, but how it happens, if it does not search for efficient or final causes, but for natural laws. Footnote. Comte. Discours préliminaire sur l'ensemble du positivisme. End footnote. To become a positive science, sociology has to satisfy a number of conditions. First, sociology's subject matter must be properly defined. The task of sociology is to investigate the collective phenomena and the collective development of the human race, being concerned with the study of man in all his aspects. L'homme dans toute son extension. Social physics is, in a sense, a branch of physiology, a continuation and indispensable complement of the natural history of man. Second, to become a positive science, sociology had to abandon the assumption that social life, the human race, as Comte put it, is entirely passive and can be changed at will by the temporal or spiritual legislator armed with appropriate authority. Third, having rejected the assumption of the omnipotence of the legislator, sociology must conceive social life as endowed with a structure or organization of social life's own, which is not only connected with, but determined by the state of civilization. Fourth, sociology as a positive science recognizes that the progressive march of civilization follows a natural and irrevocable course. Quote, La civilisation est assujetté à une marche naturelle et irrévocable, end quote, and that civilization develops according to a necessary law, quote, les progrès de la civilisation se développent suivant une loi nécessaire, end quote. Since the state of social organization is the outcome of the state of civilizations, the forces of social life and their progressive change are determined by the march of civilization, that is, by the laws of the evolution of human society. So sociology as a positive science in Comte's sense is the, quote, science of society, end quote, to which Marx adhered when he recognized that there are no fundamental differences between different kinds of human experience, that they are natural events and can be investigated by scientific method. Comte, like Saint-Simon before and Marx after Comte, rejected the view that social phenomena are reducible to biology or physiology. It was Saint-Simon who first broke with the 18th century materialistic preconceptions that the, quote, science of man, end quote, should be established on the foundations of mechanics. Saint-Simon felt that physiology, which at that time was understood to provide a general theory of living bodies, would make a more important contribution to the new science of society than mechanics, for society was a living organism and not a machine. Footnote, F.E. Manuel, The New World of Henri Saint-Simon. Having established this new link between natural science and the postulated, quote, science of man, end quote, he insisted that, quote, social physiology, end quote, dealt with a reality sui generis, distinct from the physiology of human individuals. Consequently, although they were related to each other, social and individual physiology should never be confused or regarded as identical. Comte was more specific than Saint-Simon and amplified and elucidated his doctrine. In his opinion, reductivism was a philosophical aberration. It led to materialistic metaphysics with which positivism had nothing to do, and it constituted the greatest single obstacle to the establishment of sociology as a positive science. What is true of phenomena is also true of phenomena's laws. The laws of biology are logically prior to the laws of sociology, but the laws of sociology cannot be deduced from the laws of biology. Moreover, the laws of human society are subject to change in the course of history and cannot, therefore, be particular cases of the laws of animal societies, which display neither development nor progress. Footnote. There's no footnote. Marx and all his followers accepted unconditionally the Comtean anti-reductivist principle, But neither Marx nor Marxist supporters argued this principle as ably and persuasively as Comte did. That society is an organized whole prior to the individual, and in fact determining the individual's role and action within society, is a view already clearly formulated by Saint-Simon. Quote, society is not at all a simple agglomeration of living beings whose actions, independent of any finite goal, have no other cause than the arbitrary will of individuals, and no other effects than chance events, ephemeral and unimportant accidents. On the contrary, society is, above all, a veritable organized machine, all of whose component parts contribute in a different way to the working of the whole. End quote. Comte. Footnote. No, that's not Comte, excuse me. That's, according to the citation at least, that's Henri Saint-Simon, de la physiologie appliquée à la amélioration des institutions sociales. For Saint-Simon, Comte and Marx alike, society is the true reality. Oh yeah, it says right here that Saint-Simon, I'm sorry. For Saint-Simon, Comte and Marx alike, society is the true reality, and the individual the abstraction. From the viewpoint of l'esprit positif, nothing but humanity really exists, for human individuals owe all their development to society. If society is still regarded as an abstraction, then only because this view is a survival of the theological stage. It is an essential characteristic of society qua society, which differentiates it from an animal herd, that is, from a mere plurality of individuals, that within it every action is a collective, general, and combined action, as Comte put it. Footnote. Lenin attributed to Marx the discovery that society is not a, quote, mechanical aggregation of individuals, end quote. But Lenin does not seem to have read Comte. End footnote. In a certain sense, we cannot even say that society is composed of individuals. The family is the basic social unit, for the family is homogeneous with society and gives rise to the various attitudes characteristic of individuals in society. Footnote. Comte, Cour. Aristotle too believed that the city-state grew out of the family. End footnote. Sociability is spontaneous in the human species. Individuals lean instinctively towards common life, often against their immediate interests. Sociability, it is social life, the cumulative experience and influence of past generations over the present, which, in the opinion of both Comte and Marx, has made possible the extraordinary development of the intellectual and moral functions in man. According to Comte, it is the interaction between individuals, action des individus, les uns sur les autres, and above all, quote, the gradual and continuous influence of human generations upon one another, end quote, that establishes sociology as a distinct science and is responsible for sociology's irreducibility to psychology, or to use Comte's terminology, to physiology. Moreover, social life manifests to the highest degree a universal interdependence between social life's diverse parts and a, quote, constant mutual action and reaction, end quote, which these parts exercise upon each other. This universal interdependence, the terms used by Comte are, quote, la consensus universelle and la solidarité fondamentale, end quote. which also applies to the relationships between various social institutions and the state of civilization, between political power and civil society. Footnote. For this use of the term, quote, consensus, end quote, see John Stuart Mill, A System of Logic. End footnote. The peculiar nature of social phenomena accounts for some of the distinctive characteristics of the sociological method. In sociology, the various social elements cannot be studied in isolation. Such studies are bound to be sterile. Moreover, the method proper to sociology reverses the ordinary relation between deduction and induction, both in the sciences concerned with, quote, inanimate objects, end quote, natural science, and those dealing with, quote, organized bodies, end quote, the biological and social sciences. We always have to proceed from the known to the unknown. In the first, we rise from elements and parts to the class and the whole, because knowledge of details is more accessible to us than knowledge of the ensemble. In the second, however, we begin by descending from the general to the particular, from the whole to the parts, for we are more intimately acquainted with the whole than with the parts. The sociological method serves the procedure of natural science. The sociological method reverses the procedure of natural science, because in sociology, quote, the whole is surely much better known and more accessible to us than are the diverse parts which later on can be distinguished as the whole's components, end quote. Consequently, in sociology, we first gain knowledge of the most inclusive laws and descend from them to the less inclusive laws. This Comtean rule is also a basic methodological principle of the materialist interpretation of history. Social theory must start from knowledge of directly apprehended wholes and their distinctive, quote, laws, end quote, however complicated they may be, as indeed is the case in the Marxian theory concerned with the social wholes known as socio-economic formations, and proceed on this basis to the investigation of particular problems. The laws of sociology are not the laws of human nature, psychological laws, as we would say today, for human beings are always modified by the accumulated influence of past generations, by human society, and therefore are always historically molded human beings. Unlike John Stuart Mill, Comte and Marx believed that social laws are laws sui generis, irreducible to those of psychology, and that society determines the nature and behavior of the individual rather than the other way around. Footnote. Comte's views on the relation of sociology to psychology might have been one of the reasons why Mill expressed his disappointment with the fourth volume of the Cours. See Autobiography. Karl Popper pays tribute to Marx for his challenge of Mill's methodological psychologism and sociology, but he failed to see that this tribute should be paid to, or at least shared by, Comte. End footnote. Very early in his life, Comte announced his adherence to the irreducibility of the physiology of the species. La physiologie de l'espèce, to the physiology of the individual. La physiologie de l'individu, and maintained that the study of the, quote, social phenomena of the human species, end quote, must be separated from the study of the individual taken separately outside society. To ignore the fact that human nature is a product of social life, Comte observed in a Marxian manner, is to elevate a passing phase in human evolution to the status of a permanent and indestructible human nature, or to regard essentially variable human characteristics as stable and fixed by a fanciful decree. The laws of sociology are holistic laws. The laws of sociology are not concerned with individuals, but with individuals organized groups, with the state and structure of any part of society as a whole, with the natural development of the human race, with the order and conformity to law exhibited by this development, and with the successive phases through which society must pass. Footnote. Comte did not say how his holistic sociological laws could be tested, but pointed out how they could be falsified. In his System of Logic, Book 4, Mill speaks of Comte's verification, quote, by deduction from the laws of human nature, end quote, but the term, quote, verification, end quote, is misleading in this context. If the consequences of a sociological law lead to conclusions incompatible with what we know about human behavior, the law in question should be considered as falsified. For instance, should a sociological law state that human beings have as a rule, a preponderant inclination in a good or bad direction, that reason predominates in them over their desires, or their altruistic and disinterested motives predominate over their selfishness, such a law is clearly to be rejected. No such methodological provisions are to be found in Marx to guard him against the pitfalls of holistic laws. End footnote. Consequently, in sociology, observation and the comparative method play a subordinate role, and experiments are out of the question. The specific sociological method, which allows us to deal with the problem of both social statics and social dynamics, is the historical method. Quote, no history, no sociology, end quote, Lévi-Bruhl commented, was Comte's final word on the method most appropriate and effective in social studies. Let's see if there's anything for Lévi-Bruhl. Lucien Lévi-Bruhl lived from 1857 to 1939 and was a French scholar trained in philosophy who furthered anthropology with his contributions to the budding fields of sociology and ethnology. Lucien Lévi-Bruhl's primary field interest was ways of thinking. Born in Paris, Lévi-Bruhl wrote about the mind in his work How Natives Think, published in 1910, where Lucien Lévi-Bruhl posited as the two basic mindsets of mankind the quote primitive and the quote modern. The primitive mind does not differentiate the supernatural from morality, but uses quote mystical participation end quote to manipulate the world. According to Lévi-Bruhl, the primitive mind does not address contradictions. The modern mind, by contrast, uses reflection and logic. Lucien Lévi-Bruhl did not necessarily believe in a historical and evolutionary teleology leading from the primitive mind to the modern, but this is often assumed because Lucien Lévi-Bruhl's work is rarely read in full. Rather, Lucien Lévi-Bruhl's thought is more dynamic, as shown by Lucien Lévi-Bruhl's later notebooks on primitive mentality, where Lucien Lévi-Bruhl admits that non-logical thought is common in modern societies, such as in gambling practices. Sociologist Stanislav Andrzejewski argued that despite its flaws, Lucien Lévi-Bruhl's How Natives Think was an accurate and valuable contribution to anthropology, perhaps even more so than the better-known work by Claude Lévi-Strauss. Lucien Lévi-Bruhl's work, especially the concepts of collective representations and participation mystique, influenced the psychological theory of Carl Jung. Lucien Lévi-Bruhl's thought also plays a large part in the work of Norman O. Brown. So that's who Lucien Lévi-Bruhl is. Quote, no history, back to the text. Quote, no history, no sociology, end quote. Lévi-Bruhl commented, was Comte's final word on the method most appropriate and effective in social studies. For Comte, sociology does not differ essentially from the history of civilization and the natural history of man considered in all his manifestations. Footnote, see Lucien Lévi-Bruhl's The Philosophy of Auguste Comte. End footnote. Practically all the principles of Comte's sociological theory can be found in Marx, who, however, unlike Comte, did not expound them systematically. Marx is not a systematic thinker in the sense that Marx does not define the concepts of his theoretical framework before making use of it. But Marx lays the same emphasis upon the fact that at any time the state of every part of a social system is interdependent with the state of all the other parts, that no aspect of social life should be studied separately but always in l'ensemble du sujet, that change in one social subsystem is bound to be followed by change in the other, and that the development of society from one phase to another results from a fundamental transformation that is followed and reflected in all the parts of the subsystems of the social whole. Marx shared Comte's belief that the historical method is the appropriate method for sociology, that human nature is not unchanging and universal, but unchangeable and determined by the achievements of past generations, and that sociology has to start with the most general principles before it can deal with details. Both the Comtean social dynamics and the Marxian materialist conception of history are theories of social change and evolution based on the assumption that each state of society is the necessary effect of the preceding state of society and the whole cause of the succeeding one. Shit, I lost my spot. Within this common framework, Comte and Marx agreed on some objectives of their respective undertakings and disagreed on others. Marx and Comte shared the ambition to establish a positive or naturalistic social science which could be applied to the reorganization of society as successfully as the natural sciences have been applied to the transformation of the natural environment. Marx and Comte also share the conviction that once sociology were established, that what Comte called the, quote, theological, metaphysical mode of thought, end quote, and Marx the, quote, illusion of the epoch, end quote, or more generally, quote, ideologies, end quote, would lose their stronghold and the mind would be liberated from the phantoms of the mind's own creation. The emancipation of politics from mythology, theology, and metaphysics, by which it has so long been dominated, will open a new era of human relations and a new chapter in history. The elevation of politics to the rank of positive science was, according to Comte, the most urgent task of Comte's time. Marx and Comte viewed history in a similar fashion, trying to analyze history into interdependent causal chains and to discover the filiation of the states of society on one another. Marx and Comte were in agreement that history should provide the material for the discovery of sociological laws, and that conversely sociology could help in explaining the course of history in the past and in predicting its future. They differed sharply, however, in their respective ways of perceiving and interpreting society. For Comte, society could exhibit intellectual and moral anarchy, but was essentially based on, quote, an evident and spontaneous harmony, end quote, which always, even in times of revolution, quote, tends to hold between the whole and the parts of a social system, end quote. Social solidarity results from the division of labor and is itself the basic cause of the continued extension and growing perfection of the social organism. Footnote. Durkheim took up and elaborated this idea of Comte. See The Division of Labor in Society by Durkheim. End footnote. For Marx, society was an arena of social conflicts. Class antagonism and strife provided the driving force of change and development. Comte regarded ideas and ideals as important factors which determine the course of human evolution. Comte recognized the autonomy of the moral order and assigned to it the vital task of making social and altruistic sentiments predominate over selfish and individualistic impulses, and he considered the advancement of knowledge to be the main agent in the progress of mankind, conceived as the growth of distinctively human attributes and their increasing ascendancy over our animality. For Marx, the Comtean belief in the independence of reason and the autonomy of morals was pure fantasy, unrelated to the actual course of history and to the, quote, real-life process, end quote. For instance, Marx would recognize that a steady increase in man's knowledge and mastery over nature accelerates the rate of social change. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx emphasized the incessant disturbances of all social conditions, the disruption of all fixed relations, and the rejection of all opinions as soon as they were formed, which followed the rapid scientific advance and technological change during 100 years of the rule of the bourgeoisie. By having recognized the dependence of the rate of social change upon the increase in man's knowledge, Marx considered the advance of science as a socially determined factor. Marx did not dismiss moral ideals altogether, but believed that moral ideals reflected the vital requirements inherent in the social situation of those holding them, whose outlook and actions were in turn class-determined. Again, it is enough to remind oneself of Marx's description of the social disintegration, which under the rule of the bourgeoisie and in spite of its reverential tributes to high-sounding ideals, destroys important human and social values. Bourgeois interests, Marx concluded in the Communist Manifesto, lurk in ambush behind law, morality, and religion. The sharp differences in the way in which Comte and Marx perceived and interpreted social reality were ultimately due to their mutually exclusive social values. Although they both demanded that the domain of social facts should be examined like any other field of natural phenomena, they failed to live up to their own precept. Their respective social theories are not free from an ideological critique based on evaluative criteria opposed to each other. Their theories not only seek to explain how society functions, but how society ought to function. On this account, they were bound to clash on every practical issue, however agreed they may have been on matters of pure theory. The clash of opinions on events taking place under their eyes, their conflicting social and political commitments, their fundamental differences in the general mode of conceiving the human universe, and their persistent disagreement on the evaluative level tended to obscure the fact that in their non-evaluative parts, their social theories reveal numerous striking similarities. Emile Durkheim said of Comte that he declared social facts to be facts of nature without, however, treating them as things. Footnote: Durkheim, The Rules of Sociological Method. Footnote: Durkheim, Rules of Sociological Method. End footnote. The meaning of Durkheim's charge is not entirely clear. If Durkheim wished to say that Comte failed to establish sociology as a positive science, Durkheim was perfectly right. A subject of study becomes a science only if it is presented as a systematic, logically connected body of general propositions in which the relation between the more and less inclusive concepts and statements is clearly shown, and the facts can be recognized as particular cases of a law or laws. Although Comte contributed a great deal to the discovery of the principles and the methods that could be used to make a positive science of sociology, Comte failed to apply them and give to the social science the requisite logical and systematic form. Mill challenged the opinion that Comte created sociology for another reason. Montesquieu and even Machiavelli, Turgot and Adam Smith, most of the political economists both in France and England, Bentham and his followers rejected the theological and metaphysical viewpoint in the social sciences and accepted the positive position as firmly as Comte himself. Although Comte went further than these thinkers, it was not reserved to Comte to initiate positive inquiries in sociology. Moreover, from the point of view of Mill's methodological psychologism, Comte was responsible for the grave error of having failed to see that, quote, the phenomena of man in society result from his nature as an individual being, end quote. The conclusion was, therefore, inescapable that Comte, quote, has done nothing in sociology which does not require to be done over again, and better. Nevertheless, he has greatly advanced the study, end quote. John Stuart Mill, Auguste Comte and Positivism. Durkheim's and Mill's observations converge toward a single conclusion, that while Comte did not create sociology, Comte laid the foundations on which sociology could be constructed. While Comte was engaging in discovering the principles and methodological rules which would make of sociology a positive science, Marx was exploring new avenues to social and historical knowledge. To put it differently, Comte investigated the possibility of establishing sociology, and Marx established a sociological theory. They are both founders of modern sociology, though their claim to this title is based on different credentials. New section: The elements of positivist philosophy in Engels. As has been mentioned earlier, the influence of Comte upon Engels is direct and conspicuous. The elements of positivism in Engels are most apparent in his conception of philosophy and in his views on the relation of philosophy to science. According to Comte, an essential characteristic of positive philosophy is that positive philosophy considers all phenomena as subject to invariable natural laws whose discovery enables us to make predictions and whose gradual reduction to the smallest possible number is an important mark of scientific advance. On the other hand, positive philosophy regards the search for essences, efficient and final causes, that is, causes which are not themselves physical or observable phenomena, as absolutely impracticable and meaningless. L'esprit positif, Comte wrote, quote, is generalized and systematized common sense, end quote. Comte. Comte's distinction between positive and speculative philosophy corresponds to the distinction between the empirical and metaphysical attitude. While a metaphysician claims that he grasps the reality concealed behind appearance, an empirical philosopher makes no such claim and is satisfied if his knowledge is in agreement with experience. The difference between the experimental and metaphysical method may be illustrated by the contrast between Descartes' Principia Philosophiae and J.B. Fourier's Théorie analytique de la chaleur, to which Comte referred. Descartes' Principia Philosophiae, or Principles of Philosophy, is a book by René Descartes. In essence, Principles of Philosophy is a synthesis of the discourse of method and meditations on first philosophy. Principles of Philosophy was written in Latin, published in 1644, and dedicated to Elizabeth of Bohemia, with whom Descartes had a long-standing friendship. A French version, Les Principes de la Philosophie, followed in 1647. Principles of Philosophy set forth the principles of nature, the laws of physics as Descartes viewed the laws of physics. Most notably, The principles of philosophy sets forth the principles of nature, the laws of physics, as Descartes viewed the principles of nature. Most notably, the principles of philosophy set forth the principle that in absence of external forces, an object's motion will be uniform and in a straight line. Newton borrowed this principle from Descartes and included this principle in his own Principia. To this day, it is still generally referred to as Newton's first law of motion. Principles of philosophy was primarily intended to replace the Aristotelian curriculum then used in French and British universities. Principles of philosophy provides a systematic statement of his metaphysics and natural philosophy and represents the first truly comprehensive mechanistic account of the universe. So what is being referred to earlier is what's it say here? J.B. Fourier's Théorie analytique de la chaleur translates as the analytical theory of heat. And it says Joseph Fourier lived from 1768 to 1830 and was a French mathematician and physicist born in Auxerre and best known for initiating the investigation of Fourier series, which eventually developed into Fourier analysis and harmonic analysis and their applications to problems of heat transfer and vibrations. The Fourier transform and Fourier's law of conduction are also named in his honor. Fourier is also generally credited with the discovery of the greenhouse effect. So, back to the text. The difference between the empirical and metaphysical method may be illustrated by the contrast between Descartes' principles of philosophy and J.B. Fourier's the theory of the analysis of heat, Théorie analytique de la chaleur, to which Comte referred. Descartes believed that Descartes knew the essence of matter and that Descartes could deduce all of matter's properties from this knowledge of the essence of matter. Descartes did not differentiate, therefore, between physics and metaphysics, between the study of phenomena and phenomena's laws, and the examination of the essence of matter, which Descartes regarded as the cause of physical phenomena and the source of physical phenomena's laws. On the other hand, Joseph Fourier declared at the very beginning of Joseph Fourier's treatise that Joseph Fourier did not know the fundamental causes of heat, which like gravity fills every part of space, but that these causes are subject to simple and constant laws whose study is the object of natural philosophy. Joseph Fourier's objective was to construct a theory of heat based on a few principles to which Joseph Fourier was led by common observation and which were confirmed by experiments. That science is not concerned with essences. First causes are things in themselves, both phenomena and the laws of phenomena's coexistence and succession, was a view fully endorsed by Engels. Engels subscribed to the positivistic belief that we know a thing if we know that thing's qualities. There is no sense in going any further, for there is nothing left to know. As in Comtean philosophy, successful predictions, based on the knowledge of laws, provide the test of the correctness. One second. Provide the test of the correctness of our knowledge of these laws. Views similar to those of Engels were described by John Stuart Mill as the general property of the age, but they happened to be an important part of Comte's conception of knowledge. Comte observed that the search for essences is bound to raise the claim to absolute truth. Shit, I missed a footnote. Let's see if there's anything in the footnote. Special intro. In this respect, Engels' views differed from Marx's. As will be seen later, Marx retained the distinction between the delusive appearance and the true essence of things, and declared that all science would be superfluous if the appearance of things coincided with things' essence. End footnote. I don't know where I was, but views similar to those of Engels were described by John Stuart Mill as the general property of the age, but they happened to be an important part of Comte's conception of knowledge. Comte observed that the search for essences is bound to raise the claim to absolute truth. On the other hand, a positive science gives up the pursuit of absolute knowledge by the very fact that it strives for the knowledge of laws. A law, if true at all, is never true absolutely, but always under some definite conditions. The discovery of laws depends on the available means of observation, which improve constantly and make the attainment of certainty, of absolute and perfect knowledge, recede ever further. Quote, "The relative character of scientific conceptions is necessarily inseparable from the true notion of natural laws, in the same way as the chimerical tendency to absolute knowledge spontaneously accompanies whatever use we make of the theological fictions and metaphysical entities." End quote. Comte. The doctrine of the relativity of knowledge implies that the search for absolute knowledge is futile and that the history of human conceptions of the world is the only positive theory of knowledge. The mind can examine ways of acquiring knowledge only by the investigation of the successive products of the mind's own cognitive activity. The doctrine of the relativity of knowledge is an integral part of Engels' philosophy of science. Engels regarded Hegel's claim to having discovered absolute truth as one of the most serious objections to Hegelian philosophy. A system of natural and historical knowledge, Engels wrote, can make giant strides from age to age. No single philosopher is able to accomplish what can only be achieved by the entire human race in its progressive development. Once this is realized, quote, "there is an end to all philosophy in the hitherto accepted sense of the word philosophy. One leaves alone, quote, abstract truth," end quote, which is unattainable along this path, or by any single individual. Instead, one pursues attainable relative truths along the path of the positive sciences, and the summation of their results by means of dialectical thinking, end quote. Engels, Ludwig Feuerbach. It is true that Engels credited Hegel with having shown Marx and himself the, quote, way out of the labyrinth of systems to real positive knowledge of the world, end quote. Although in Engels' mind his emancipation from the cult of the system might have been associated psychologically with Hegel, actually there is no logical connection between Hegelian speculations and Engels' abandonment of philosophy as a system of constructing activity. In spite of his admiration for Hegel, Engels did not accept Hegel's announcement that in his philosophy the reconciliation of ideas and reality had been effected, leaving nothing else for others to do. Incredible as it may appear, there were German philosophers who took Hegel's verdict seriously. Quote, "The deep surge of conviction that philosophy had come to an end colored the first decades after Hegel's death," end quote. That quotes from Herbert Marcuse in Reason and Revolution. But Engels was not among these philosophers. Engels ignored the claim that in Hegel, philosophy had reached philosophy's destination, and that, quote, the negation of philosophy, end quote, having been accomplished, there was no further room or need for philosophical thinking. Engels' definition of the new function of philosophy combined the Comtean criticism of speculative knowledge and the efforts to restore metaphysics to metaphysics' previous position over and above positive science. To discover this problem more fully, it should first be approached from another direction. Comte thought that only the establishment of sociology as a positive or natural science, une science naturelle, as he sometimes used to say, could safeguard the positivist conception of knowledge and protect human intelligence from a relapse into the theologico-metaphysical mode of thought. Two arguments might be used in support of this view. First, the intellectual and moral life has always been the main source of theological and metaphysical conceptions, and a positive sociological study of these and other social phenomena should close the gap through which the metaphysical invasion of materialism or spiritualism usually took place. Second, with the establishment of sociology, positive philosophy acquires true universality. In spite of their distinctiveness, the six fundamental sciences constitute only different branches of a single tree. Between the six fundamental sciences, they can deal with all the facts which ever occur and apply in their examination one single procedure of investigation. As Durkheim put it, from the moment when it is recognized that above the individual there is society, a system of active forces, a new manner of explaining men, neither materialistic nor supernaturalistic becomes possible. A new manner of explaining men, neither materialistic nor positive supernaturalistic becomes possible. These views are to be found again in Engels. With the establishment of the materialistic conception of history, quote, idealism was driven from idealism's last refuge, the philosophy of history, end quote. These views are to be found again in Engels. Marx's discovery of a method applicable to every realm of human life, explaining human knowledge and the whole range of man's activity, provided the keystone of modern materialism, that is, naturalism, and made it possible to study all human phenomena, from the lowest to the highest, as natural events. Quote, modern materialism ... no longer needs any philosophy standing above the other sciences. As soon as each special science is bound to make clear that special science's position in the great totality of things and our knowledge of things, a special science dealing with this totality is superfluous. That which still survives, independently of all earlier philosophy, is the science of thought and thought's law, formal logic and dialectics. Everything else is subsumed in the positive science of nature and history, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. It was Engels' view that the establishment of Marxian sociology, which enables us to study the intellectual, moral, and general, the spiritual life of man by the scientific method, provides modern materialism with the universality which it hitherto lacked. Since all facts could be investigated by the same method, philosophy could no longer claim a separate realm of reality as philosophy's own exclusive preserve. But whereas in agreement with Comte, Engels maintained that speculative philosophy as a pre-scientific mode of investigation of any subject matter became superfluous with the establishment of the system of positive science. He also deviated from the Comtean conception, where he did not seem to hold this view about philosophy, which was not speculative in the above sense. It has been said of Comte that Comte did not leave any room in Comte's system of positive science for philosophy, not even for a methodology or a logic of science. One of Comte's fundamental ideas, repeatedly emphasized in the Cours, is that methods cannot be studied apart from the investigation in which those methods are applied, or that the problems of positive science cannot be neatly divided into substantive and methodological problems. The study of scientific method apart from scientific method's application is conceivable but neither necessary nor advisable. The logic of a science can best be seen in operation through the science itself, of which it is the logic. On the other hand, the study of the system of positive science as a whole belongs to social statics and social dynamics. Science is a component part of civilization, and the connection between various elements of civilization are the subject matter of sociology. The expansion of l'esprit positif and the establishment of sociology, which completes the system of positive science, culminate in philosophy, making philosophy self-redundant. That the advancement of knowledge leads to gradual extinction of philosophy is a view which both Marx and Engels seem to have adopted, though Engels with some important qualifications. Marx and Engels' endorsement of this view is sometimes considered as conclusive evidence of the influence of French positivism exercised upon Marx and Engels. In the German ideology, Marx described the progressive elimination of philosophy as an... Yeah. All right, I'll be out. In the German ideology, Marx described the progressive elimination of philosophy as an inevitable development in the advance of knowledge. Quote, where speculation ends in real life, there, real positive science, as the representation of the practical activity and the practical development of men, begins. Empty and irrelevant talk about consciousness ceases and real knowledge has to take its place. When reality is depicted, philosophy as an independent branch of activity loses philosophy's medium of existence. At the most, its place can only be taken by a summary of the general results which are derived by abstraction from the historical development of men. Considered in themselves and detached from real history, these abstractions have no value whatsoever. End quote. Marx, German ideology. Some of Engels' statements on this matter point in the same direction. They seem to imply that with the establishment of the materialist conception of history, modern materialism no longer requires philosophy, conceived as the universal science, and standing above the other sciences, which were its more or less distinctly separate parts. Footnote. Engels, Anti-Düring. The criticized view was, as a matter of fact, the Hegelian conception of philosophy. End footnote. Marxist-Leninists in the Soviet Union and elsewhere have challenged the interpretation attributing to Engels the positivist view about the end of philosophy. See Adam Schaff. Although Engels did state that modern materialism no longer needed, quote, any philosophy standing above the other sciences, end quote, Engels added a proviso which conferred upon his statement a different meaning. Quote, it, bracket, modern materialism, end bracket, is no longer a philosophy at all, but simply a world outlook which has to establish its validity, and be applied not in a science of sciences standing apart, but in the positive sciences. Philosophy is therefore, quote, sublated, end quote, here, that is, quote, both overcome and preserved, end quote, overcome as regards its form, and preserved as it regards its real content, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. Marxist-Leninists maintain that when Engels spoke of the end of, quote, all philosophy, end quote, Engels meant only, quote, all philosophy in the hitherto accepted sense of the word, end quote. Engels supported positive knowledge against futile speculations, but Engels also added that the positive sciences are not self-sufficient. The positive sciences remain forever provisional and require, quote, the summation of their results by means of dialectical thinking, end quote. Engels. While acknowledging the increasing erosion of philosophy by the steady advance of positive knowledge, Engels left no doubt whatsoever that philosophy retained and would continue to hold philosophy's controlling position as a general theory of science which, quote, brings the individual spheres of knowledge into the correct connection with one another. It is actually impossible to renounce philosophy altogether without falling under the domination of the worst philosophy possible. Engels' Dialectics of Nature, or see Engels' Dialectics of Nature. When the, quote, positive science of nature and history, end quote, is established, much of, quote, all earlier philosophy, end quote, becomes extinct. But philosophy does not disappear altogether in positive science, for there remains the, quote, science of thought and science and its law, quote, the science of thought and thought's laws, formal logic and dialectics, end quote. Engels, Anti-Düring. There is no perfect analogy between the Comtean conception of philosophy and Engels' conception of philosophy. The Marxist-Leninist objection to attributing Comte's conception of philosophy to Engels seems to be justified. Engels did qualify the view of philosophy becoming unnecessary or superfluous. He saw not only a distinct function, but also a distinct subject matter for philosophy which, in contradistinction to the pre-Hegelian philosophy, and in deference to Hegel, he called, quote, dialectics, end quote. According to Engels' familiar doctrine, dialectics, quote, is the science of the general laws of motion and development of nature, human society, and thought, end quote, and thus attains a truly universal knowledge, surpassing in the generality and certainty of its conclusions anything that a positive science might prove. That quotes Anti-Düring. Its conclusions, anything that positive science might provide. Jesus Christ. I'm fucking up. Like Hegel's reason at the speculative stage, philosophy in Engels' sense, that is, dialectics, stands over and above the particular sciences. Engels' view differs, however, from Hegel's in that Engels saw a greater complexity in the relation of philosophy to the particular sciences. Engels recognized that philosophy was dependent upon the positive sciences because the positive sciences determine the existing state of knowledge and thereby the subject matter of philosophy. On the other hand, however, the task of philosophy was to grasp and generalize the knowledge provided by the particular sciences, and thus philosophy was in a position to dominate them and to legislate as how they should proceed in their investigations. In later years, Engels' semi-positivistic and semi-metaphysical conception of philosophy led to some baneful consequences, for Marxist-Leninists took advantage of it to justify the interference of politicians, ideologists, and political philosophers into the methodological and substantive problems of science. Engels was not... There's a footnote here. Let's see if it says anything. No. Engels was not the first in assigning these incompatible functions to philosophy. The same idea can be found in Saint-Simon in some revisions of the original positivist doctrine. Both during Comte's lifetime and after his death. According to Saint-Simon, philosophy was the universal science, science universelle, of which the particular sciences were the elements. Therefore, as soon as the latter had become positive, the former would become wholly positive too. This meant, however, that the only task of philosophy was to systematize the whole of knowledge, and Saint-Simon was not prepared to accept this consequence. For in its application to social physiology, philosophy became a study of man and society and acquired a second function, irreducible to the systematization of positive knowledge. This study involved the problem of politics, morality, and religion, dealt with values, value judgments, and norms, and neither was nor could any longer be made positive in the original meaning of the word. Hence the duality in Saint-Simon's attitude to philosophy, behind which was concealed the inescapable fact that if philosophy were reduced to a sort of encyclopedia of positive knowledge, it could not supply a code of ethics. Saint-Simon wanted philosophy to perform two incompatible functions, and hence reached the paradoxical position that, quote, positive philosophy remained speculative, even though positive philosophy had purportedly been disarmed of the poisonous fangs of speculation, end quote. That quote is from W.M. Simon, quote, History for Utopia, Saint-Simon and the Idea of Progress, end quote. And the footnote says, La Nouveau Christianisme is often interpreted as an explicit recognition by Saint-Simon that science is unable to support morals. End footnote. The same duality reappeared in some interpretations of Comtean positivism. On the one hand, there was John Stuart Mill, who in his essay Auguste Comte and Positivism was inclined to define positivism as a mode of thought or a philosophy of science. Since Mill understood by philosophy, quote, the scientific knowledge of man as an intellectual, moral, and social being, end quote, this definition of philosophy disposed him to regard the logic of science, the investigation of the process by which knowledge is acquired and validated, as the core of positive philosophy. Footnote, see John Stuart Mill, Auguste Comte and Positivism, page 53. End footnote. Mill's view of positivism might be described as its minimalistic interpretation, for it emphasized the concern of positive philosophy with epistemological and methodological questions in the natural and social sciences. In the minimalistic interpretation, there is no room for philosophy as a branch of knowledge with a subject matter of its own, distinct from and independent of positive science. On the other hand, Émile Littré, I think I already looked up, but I'm going to look them up again, because I don't remember. Émile Littré lived from 1801 to 1881 and was a French lexicographer, Freemason, and philosopher, best known for his Dictionnaire de la langue française, commonly known as Le Littré. And we already looked up Lucien Levy-Brou. Anyway, sorry. On the other hand, Émile Littré in France, later seconded by Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, defined positivism as, quote, a view of the world that results from the systematized whole of positive knowledge, end quote. Footnote. See D.G. Charlton, Positivist Thought in France, page 55, end footnote. In this capacity, positivism is a true Weltanschauung, capable of providing a faith, an ideal, a view of history, and a commitment in the destiny of humanity. In the maximalist interpretation of positivism, the emphasis upon its conception of knowledge is strangely combined with the traditional view of philosophy as a comprehensive synthesis whose main function is to give us bearings and a sense of purpose in life. The desertion of the strict positivist standpoint and the tendency to combine positivism with theories that are alien to positivism can be traced to Comte himself, at least during his, quote, second career, end quote. The presence of non-positivist elements in Comte has usually been explained by his divided intellectual allegiance, by the tension and conflict which Comte did not manage to resolve between the requirements of science and of social reconstruction. But Comte was by no means alone in revising and complementing positivism by adding ethics, metaphysics, or religion to science. In the mid-19th century, a number of French thinkers who regarded themselves as supporters of positivism, Ernest Renan, who I think is like a nationalist guy, I don't know, maybe that name looks familiar, but I'm not sure, and Hippolyte Taine, at their head, were unwilling to accept strictly the implications of the specific conclusions of the positivist philosophy of science. Wikipedia says Ernest Renan lived from 1823 to 1892 and was a French Orientalist, Semitic scholar writing on Semitic languages and civilizations, historian of religion, philologist, philosopher, biblical scholar, and critic. Ernest Renan wrote works on the origins of early Christianity and espoused popular political theories, especially concerning nationalism, national identity, and the alleged superiority of white people over other human, quote, races, end quote. God, I know everything. Ernest Renan is known as being among the first scholars to advance the disputed Khazar theory, which held that Ashkenazi Jews were descendants of the Khazars, Turkic peoples who had adopted the Jewish religion and allegedly migrated to Central and Eastern Europe following the collapse of their Khanate. So that's Ernest Renan. And who's Hippolyte Taine? Hippolyte Taine lived from 1828 to 1893 and was a French historian, critic, and philosopher. Hippolyte Taine was the chief theoretical influence on French naturalism, a major proponent of sociological positivism, and one of the first practitioners of historicist criticism. Literary historicism was a critical movement, as has been said. Literary historicism as a critical movement has been said to originate with Hippolyte Taine. Hippolyte Taine is also remembered for his attempts to provide a scientific account of literature. Hippolyte Taine had a profound effect on French literature. The 1911 Encyclopedia Britannica asserted that, quote, the tone which pervades the works of Zola, Bourget, and Maupassant can be immediately attributed to the influence we call Taine's, end quote. Out of the trauma of 1871, Taine has been said by one scholar to have, quote, forged the architectural structure of modern French right-wing historiography, end quote. So a couple of charming characters there. In the mid-19th century, back to the text, reread the sentence that I just looked up these people from. In the mid-19th century, a number of French thinkers who regarded themselves as supporters of positivism, with Ernest Renan and Hippolyte Taine at their head, were unwilling to accept strictly the implications and the specific conclusions of the positivist philosophy of science. Their reluctance to recognize the inherent limitations of human experience led to the misinterpretation of positivist philosophy, to the point of distorting positivist philosophy into a quite different doctrine. The distortion arose from the substitution of scientism for positivist philosophy. The distortion arose from the substitution of scientism for positivist philosophy, and from the merging of this redefined positivism with the Hegelian speculative philosophy. Footnote. Quote, scientism, end quote, as used above, designates not only the attitude of respect for science, science's achievements and method, but also and above all the belief that science alone can effectively create and support a stable and rational moral and social order. Scientism in this sense is an attitude incompatible with positivism. End footnote. On the supposition that scientism was the essence of positivism, it became possible to regard oneself as a positivist without recognizing positivism's epistemological assumptions. In order to be a positivist, it was sufficient to extol the concept and value of scientific knowledge, which was to gain in significance and comprehensiveness by its affiliation with speculative philosophy. Philosophy was defined as a universal science entirely different from the old metaphysics, because philosophy derived philosophy's conclusions by inference from scientific facts, while the fusion of the two inflexibly antagonistic philosophical attitudes or schools of thought produced in due time an anti-positivist reaction. It was first used or misused to establish the, quote, scientific, end quote, social, political, and ethical system of Comte, the, quote, scientific, end quote, religion of Ernest Renan, and the, quote, scientific, end quote, method for metaphysics of Hippolyte Taine. See D.G. Charlton, Positivist Thought in France. Engels was clearly affected by the intellectual tendency of the time. Engels' conception of philosophy and philosophy's relation to science is based on the strange alliance of positivism with Hegelianism, that is, with the most extreme form of anti-positivism. Engels claimed that by using the methodology of positivism, Engels could establish metaphysical conclusions comparable in scope and content with those of Hegel's speculative philosophy. But to maintain that metaphysical knowledge could be reached by the positivist method is not only to mix Comte and Hegel, but to renounce both Comte and Hegel at the same time. For Comte, empirical knowledge constituted the whole of science. For Hegel, empirical knowledge served only as a medium in which the mind developed the mind's self-consciousness, and therefore empirical knowledge lay entirely outside of what Hegel regarded as science, that is, speculative philosophy. For Hegel, all knowledge based on factual evidence was uncertain and problematic. The knowledge of facts was reliable only as far as it was derived from the first principles, which alone could be known with an absolute intuitive certainty. For Comte, the knowledge of facts was primary and the knowledge of principles was secondary. Where the knowledge of facts was as certain as anything could be, the reliability of every principle depended on the role which that principle played in ordering the variety of facts and in furthering our control over those facts. Positivism is incompatible with idealism as well as with materialism, for they are both metaphysical doctrines in the positivist meaning of this expression. They go beyond the limits of observation and empirical verification and maintain that all phenomena derive from material or spiritual substance respectively. From the viewpoint of positivist epistemology, it is a great fallacy to claim universally valid knowledge which transcends the apparent limitations of human experience and is thus immune to doubt. On its part, Hegelian philosophy represents a complete refutation of positivism in its historically known form. Hegelian philosophy rejects the authority of experience and the certainty of facts as the negation of philosophical truth, because facts are independent of, but quote, facts are not independent of, but quote, posited, end quote, by the subject. Hegelian philosophy sets the liberating knowledge of essences over against the submissive acceptance of observable facts and verifiable laws, and proclaims the predominance of the universal over the particular. To have any rationality, everything immediately, quote, given, has first to be justified before reason, which alone is capable of making final and irrevocable pronouncements. Quote, Hegelian positivism, end quote, is an apt denotation of Engels' view on the relation of philosophy to scientific knowledge. Footnote. Quote, Hegelian positivism, end quote, is a term introduced by F.A. Hayek in The Counter-Revolution of Science, where it is used to denote a mixture of Comtean and Hegelian ideas. Wilhelm had observed that in the materialist conception of history, quote, motives from Hegel and from Comte cross in a peculiar manner, end quote. See Wilhelm Windelband's A History of Philosophy. The similarities between Hegel's and Comte's social philosophies are the subject of a recent comprehensive study by Oskar Necht. Structure, Beziehungen zwischen den Gesellschaftslehren Comtes und Hegels. Max Horkheimer and T.W. Adorno suggest in the preface to Necht's book that since both Hegel and Comte supported the bourgeoisie and were the bourgeoisie's defenders against the already rising social forces which were eventually to engulf the rising bourgeoisie, eventually to engulf the bourgeoisie, the similarities of Hegel and Comte's views are not as puzzling as they might appear. It is more than doubtful whether this kind of explanation explains anything. End footnote. So, back to the text. Quote, Hegelian positivism, end quote, is an apt denotation for Engels' views on the relation of philosophy to scientific knowledge. Engels wished to construct, on the firm basis of the system of positive science, the superstructure of a speculative philosophy possessing legislative powers with respect to the realm of facts. Engels' invective against, quote, gross or, quote, shallow or, quote, one-sided empiricism, end quote, which can be found in many pages of Dialectics of Nature, seems to indicate that in Engels' opinion, the system of positive science stood in need of supervision by speculative philosophy. This supervision of positive science by speculative philosophy was to be established not only by the subordination of science to philosophy, but also by the reduction of the fundamental laws of particular sciences to a set of supreme universal laws, which would show that the former can be inferred from the latter. Such a reduction, which in Engels' view is the essence of the Hegelian conception of philosophy, is incompatible with positivism and cannot be accomplished without relapsing, to put it in the Comtean language, into the theological metaphysical mode of thought. The irreducibility of the laws of particular sciences to the laws of the universe as a whole is a consequence of the positivist epistemology and philosophy of science. The assumptions derived from Hegel and Comte are irreconcilable. The discordant thoughts and divergent attitudes which Hegel and Comte produce cannot be removed or adjusted without allowing one of the antagonists to overpower the other antagonist. Hegel and Comte cannot be joined together in the expectation that Comte and Hegel would achieve jointly what neither Comte nor Hegel could accomplish separately. Engels parted ways with Comte and chose a course which, according to Comte, in his sober mood, is une absurde utopie, and misuse of the deductive method for purposes for which the deductive method was not designed, a course based on a false evaluation of our mental powers as well as of the difficulties involved. Comte pointed out that our knowledge of the laws of the universe is fragmentary, that the number of distinct and independent, i.e. irreducible laws which would have to be considered is much larger than is usually imagined. Footnote. Comte probably had in mind Saint-Simon, who played with the ideas that a single principle like the law of gravity, correctly interpreted, would be sufficient to deduce all others from it. See Henri Saint-Simon, Mémoire sur la science de l'homme, and F.E. Manuel, The New World of Henri Saint-Simon. End footnote. Comte pointed out that our knowledge of the laws of the universe is fragmentary, that the number of distinct and independent, i.e. irreducible laws which would have to be considered is much larger than is usually imagined, and that the way in which they work together in order to produce a given result is too intricate to be correctly traced by human reason. Mythesis universalis is beyond the reach of the human mind, and to try to construct a deductive system comprising the whole knowledge is a chase to a, quote, chimerical unity, end quote. No progress of lasting value can be achieved by searching for the unity of knowledge in Engels' sense. That is, for a system in which all particular laws are deducible from a set of primordial laws dominating the universe as a whole. Footnote. It should be added, however, that Comte recognized the existence of encyclopedic laws applying unlike physical or astronomical laws to all phenomena whatsoever. See his Cours and Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, The Philosophy of Auguste Comte. These encyclopedic laws resemble the laws of dialectics. Thus, for instance, Newton's first law of motion, transformed into an encyclopedic law, explains inertia in mechanics, habits in living bodies, and the conservative inclination in human society. It is not clear what status Comte assigned to these encyclopedic laws. End footnote. End of chapter. Thank you for listening.